I stood in the middle of my own restaurant, the Heritage, wearing a server's uniform that felt like a costume on my skin, balancing a tray of champagne flutes while the Ashford family's eyes burned holes into me. It was Miles's big night. My brother-in-law had just been named senior partner at some fancy financial firm, and they'd chosen my place in Brooklyn to throw the party. Not because they respected me, but because it was convenient, and they assumed I'd give them a deal. I wasn't even supposed to be serving tonight, but Noah, my manager, called me an hour ago, voice tight, saying we were short-staffed. So here I was, Callan Ward, the guy who built this place from nothing, passing out drinks to people who looked at me like I was dirt on their shoes. The air smelled of roasted garlic and rosemary from the kitchen, but it couldn't mask the sourness of their whispers. "That's Clarissa's husband?" The waiter, one of her cousins, muttered, loud enough for me to hear as I set a glass down. My wife was across the room, her dark hair swept up, laughing with her parents, Dorian and Miriam, like she didn't notice the way they were slicing me apart with their eyes. I wanted to believe she was just distracted, caught up in the moment, but deep down, I knew better. She'd been pulling away for months, maybe years, ever since I left my old life behind. I adjusted the tray, careful not to let the glasses wobble, and moved through the crowd, my shoes clicking softly on the polished wood floor. This restaurant was my dream, every inch of it. Those reclaimed oak tables, the brass light fixtures, the open kitchen where you could hear the sizzle of steaks on the grill. I'd poured everything into it, but to them, it was just a building where I played cook. Miles was the star tonight, all slick hair and tailored suit, shaking hands with clients who probably made more in a month than I'd see in a year. He caught my eye as I passed, his smirk sharp enough to cut glass, and said, "Hey, keep those drinks coming, yeah?" I nodded, jaw tight, because what else could I do? Call him out in front of everyone? Tell him I'd paid for half the liquor he was guzzling? No, I wasn't here to make a scene. I was here to help, to make sure the night went smooth, even if it meant swallowing their insults like bitter wine. The truth was, I didn't mind pitching in. I'd bust tables and wash dishes when we first opened, back when it was just me, Jonas, and Priya against the world. Those days taught me more than any corner office ever could. But tonight wasn't about nostalgia, it was about surviving a room full of people who thought I'd failed at life. Dorian, with his silver hair and permanent scowl, leaned over to Miriam and muttered something that made her lips purse. I didn't need to hear it to know what they were saying. They'd never hidden their disappointment in me, not since the day I married their daughter and refused to play by their rules. To them, success meant titles and bank accounts, not a guy in an apron who cared about perfecting a beurre blanc sauce. I glanced at Clarissa again, hoping for a look, a nod, anything to show she was still on my side, but she was deep in conversation with some guy in a blazer, her smile bright and practiced, the kind she used to save for me. I set the tray down on a side table and flexed my hands, trying to shake off the weight in my chest. Part of me wanted to walk out, let them handle their own damn party, but I couldn't do that to Noah or the staff. They were family, the kind that didn't judge you for chasing what mattered. I scanned the room, taking in the laughter, the clinking glasses, the way everyone seemed to belong except me. It wasn't just that they saw me as a waiter, it was that they saw me as nothing at all. A guy who'd thrown away a real career to mess around with pots and pans. Even my wife, who used to lie awake with me talking about our dreams, had started echoing their words lately, asking why I couldn't just go back to finance, be someone they could brag about. I picked up a new tray, this one loaded with canapes, tiny bites of smoked salmon, and dill I'd helped prep that morning, and started another lap. The chatter grew louder, a mix of congratulations for Miles and gossip about people I didn't know. I caught snippets as I moved. "He's taking the firm to new heights, such a catch. Can you believe she settled for that?" That last one stung, and I knew it was about me. I kept my head down, focusing on the rhythm of placing plates, clearing empties, anything to stay grounded. But every step felt heavier, like I was carrying more than just food. I built this place to prove something, not to them but to myself, and yet here I was, letting their words crawl under my skin. Then I heard it, clear as a bell, Miriam's voice, sharp and dripping with disgust. "It's embarrassing, really. My daughter deserves better than a man who serves for a living." I froze, my hand halfway to a table, the tray wobbling just enough to make the glasses clink. A few heads turned, but not hers. She was staring at Dorian, her face flushed from wine and anger, and he nodded like she'd just said the sky was blue. I waited for Clarissa to say something, anything, to shut it down, but she just stood there, her eyes flicking to the floor. My throat tightened, and for a second, I thought about dropping the tray and walking away, not just from the party, but from all of it. The marriage, the family, the constant fight to be seen. But I didn't. I straightened up, steadied the glasses, and kept moving, because that's what I'd always done. Kept going, even when it hurt. By the time I made it back to the kitchen, my shirt was sticking to my back, and not just from the heat. Noah was there, barking orders to the line cooks, but he paused when he saw me. "You good, boss?" he asked, his voice low enough that no one else heard. I forced a smile, because what could I say? That I was falling apart in my own restaurant? That the people I loved most thought I was a disgrace? "Yeah, just keeping the machine running," I said, setting the tray down. He didn't push, just clapped me on the shoulder and went back to work. I stood there for a moment, breathing in the chaos of sizzling pans and shouted orders, and told myself I could get through this. One night, one party, one more round of their poison. I didn't know then that everything was about to change, that in just a few hours, their smug little world would crack open. All I knew was that I was still standing, still here, and that had to count for something. I stood at the edge of the party, wiping down a table that didn't need cleaning, just to have something to do with my hands while the Ashfords tore me apart without saying a word. The heritage was alive tonight, the dining room glowing under soft lights, filled with the hum of conversation and the clink of silverware. But I felt like a ghost in my own place. Miles was holding court near the bar, his laugh loud and practiced, surrounded by people in suits who nodded like he was preaching gospel. My wife was there too, her hand resting on his arm, her smile sharp and perfect, the kind that used to make my heart race but now just left me hollow. I'd heard it all before, their whispers, their jabs, the way they looked at me like I was a stain on their family name. To them, I wasn't Callan Ward, the guy who'd built a restaurant from nothing. I was the man who'd walked away from a real career, the one who'd traded a corner office for a chef's coat and a dream they couldn't understand. A glorified food handler. Miles had called me once, right to my face, and the memory still burned, especially tonight, when I was playing server just to keep things running. I moved to clear some empty plates, my fingers brushing against the smooth ceramic, and caught a glimpse of Dorian and Miriam at their table, their heads bent together, talking low. They didn't need to raise their voices for me to know what they were saying. It was the same script they'd been reading from since I married their daughter: disappointment, judgment, that cold certainty that I'd never measure up. I used to think I could change their minds, that if I worked hard enough, built something solid, they'd see me for more than the guy who didn't fit their mold. But years of trying had taught me better. They didn't care about the late nights I'd spent scrubbing floors or the loans I'd taken to keep this place alive. To them, success was a title on a business card, not the smell of fresh bread baking at dawn. I glanced at my wife again, hoping for a flicker of something pride, maybe, or even just a look that said she still believed in me. But she was laughing at something Miles said, her eyes bright, and I felt like I was watching her from the other side of a wall. The truth was, I'd never been enough for the Ashfords, not since the day I showed up in a second-hand suit to ask for Clarissa's hand. Back then, I was still in finance, pulling six figures and wearing the right kind of watch, but even that hadn't impressed them. They wanted someone with a pedigree, someone who'd gone to the same schools as Miles, who knew the right people and played the right games. I thought marrying her would prove I belonged, but it only made things worse. Once I left my job to start the heritage, it was like I'd signed my own exile papers. "Why can't you just be practical?" she'd asked me more than once, her voice sharp with frustration. "Why do you have to do everything the hard way?" I didn't know how to explain that this place wasn't just a job. It was who I was. Every menu, every table, every damn light bulb in here was a piece of me, and I'd thought she understood that once. I carried a stack of plates to the kitchen, the noise of the party fading behind me as I pushed through the swinging doors. The air back here was warm, thick with the smell of garlic and thyme, and for a second, I could breathe again. Noah was at the grill, flipping steaks with a focus that always calmed me down. "You holding up out there?" he asked without looking up, his voice cutting through the sizzle. I set the plates by the sink and shrugged, because what could I say? That my own family thought I was a failure? That my wife was starting to agree with them? "Just another night," I said, grabbing a towel to wipe my hands. He didn't push, just nodded and went back to work, and I was grateful for it. Out there, I was a punching bag, but in here, I was still the guy who called the shots. Back in the dining room, the party was picking up, the crowd thicker now, everyone toasting Miles like he'd invented money itself. I grabbed a pitcher of water and started refilling glasses, moving quietly so I wouldn't draw attention. But it didn't matter, they saw me anyway. One of Clarissa's aunts leaned over to her friend, her voice low but not low enough. It's such a shame, isn't it? She could have done so much better. I kept my eyes on the picture, my grip tight, pretending I hadn't heard. I'd learned a long time ago to let their words slide off me. But tonight, they stuck, each one like a splinter I couldn't pull out. I wanted to tell them they were wrong, that this restaurant wasn't just some hobby I'd stumbled into. I'd planned it for years, saved every penny, studied every chef I could find, because I wanted to create something that lasted, something that wasn't just numbers on a screen. But they wouldn't care. To them, I'd always be the guy who threw it all away. I finished the water rounds and stepped back, leaning against the wall for a moment to catch my breath. My wife was still with Miles, her hand on his shoulder now, and I wondered when she'd stopped looking for me in a room. She used to come by the restaurant after work, back when it was just a hole in the wall with no sign out front, and we'd sit on crates in the alley, dreaming about what it could be. Now, she only came when there was a reason, like tonight, and even then, it was like I was invisible. Just dress normal, she'd told me before the party, her voice tight. They'll ask why you're not doing anything with your life if you wear that coat. She meant my chef's coat, the one I'd earned through years of burns and blisters. I'd laughed it off, thinking she was just nervous, but now, watching her blend so easily into their world, I wasn't so sure. I pushed off the wall and grabbed a tray of appetizers, forcing myself to keep moving. The night wasn't over, and I wasn't going to let them see me break. I'd built this place to be more than a restaurant. It was a promise to myself that I didn't need their approval to matter. But as I wove through the crowd, their eyes on me like knives, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was losing something more than their respect. My wife's laughter rang out again, and for the first time, it didn't sound like home. I told myself it was just the stress, the long hours, the weight of their judgment pressing down on me. But deep down, I knew it was more than that. I was starting to wonder if the woman I loved still loved the man I'd become, or if she'd already traded me in for their version of who I should be. I stood behind the bar at the Heritage, polishing glasses that were already spotless, just to keep my hands busy while the party roared on without me. The dining room was a sea of suits and sparkling dresses, everyone toasting Miles like he'd hung the moon, and I was just the guy making sure their glasses stayed full. My wife was out there somewhere, probably smiling at another one of her brother's stories, and I tried not to think about how she hadn't looked my way all night. Instead, I let my mind drift back to 6 years ago, when I walked away from a life that looked good on paper but felt like a cage. I'd been pulling $140,000 a year in finance, crunching numbers in a midtown office, wearing suits that cost more than my rent. It was the kind of job the Ashfords respected, the kind that made my wife's parents nod approvingly when we got engaged. But every morning, I'd wake up with a knot in my chest, knowing I was living someone else's idea of success. So I left it all behind, quit the job, sold the fancy watch, and bet everything on a dream that felt bigger than me. It started with Jonas and Priya, my best friends since college, the only people who didn't think I was crazy when I said I wanted to open a restaurant. We'd sit up late, sketching ideas on napkins, talking about food like it was art. Jonas was the numbers guy, always crunching budgets in his head, while Priya had a knack for flavors, mixing spices like a painter with a palette. Me? I was the glue, the one who believed we could actually pull it off. We found a rundown spot in Brooklyn, a brick box with busted windows and a leaky roof, and we poured everything into it, our savings, our sleep, our sanity. The first year was brutal. I bussed tables, scrubbed floors, and washed dishes until my hands cracked, not because I had to, but because I wanted to understand every piece of this world I was building. I'd sneak into Michelin-starred kitchens on my days off, watching chefs move like dancers, learning how to plate a dish so it told a story. Those nights, I'd come home smelling like grease and possibility, and I'd lie awake, dreaming of the day the Heritage would be more than just a gamble. I set the glass down and grabbed another, my reflection flickering in the polished surface. Back then, my wife used to believe in me. She'd sit with me in that empty dining room, her shoes off, laughing about how we'd serve burgers to presidents someday. She knew what it cost me to walk away from finance, the long hours, the debt, the looks from her family that said I'd lost my mind. But she'd hold my hand and tell me it was worth it, that we were building something real. Somewhere along the way, though, that version of her faded. Now, she flinched when I talked about the restaurant, like it was a phase I should have outgrown. You could still go back, she'd say, her voice soft but pointed. There's no shame in a steady paycheck. I didn't know how to tell her that going back would be like cutting out a piece of myself. This place wasn't just a job, it was the only thing that made me feel alive. I glanced out at the party, catching sight of Miles's smug grin as he clinked glasses with some guy in a Rolex. The Ashfords thought he was the golden child, the one who'd made it, while I was the fool who'd thrown it all away. They didn't know about the nights I'd spent sleeping on a cot in the office, or the time Jonas and I had to beg the bank for an extension on our loan. They didn't know about the first time we got a good review, how Priya cried reading it because it meant we weren't just dreamers anymore. To them, I was a guy who'd traded a future for a hobby, and no amount of explaining would change that. I wondered what they'd say if they knew how close we'd come to losing everything, or how it felt to walk into this place every morning and see my name on the sign. Probably nothing. They'd just shake their heads and call it a waste. I moved to the sink, rinsing a few stray glasses, the cold water snapping me back to the present. The party was in full swing now, the air thick with perfume and ambition, and I was still on the outside looking in. I didn't mind helping out tonight, no one needed me, and I'd never been too proud to get my hands dirty. But every time I caught one of their glances, it was like a reminder that I didn't belong in their world. My wife's parents were at their table, Dorian's arm around Miriam's chair, both of them watching Miles like he was their legacy. I used to think I could win them over, that if I worked hard enough, they'd see what I was building here. But after years of their cold shoulders and backhanded comments, I'd started to wonder if it was even worth trying. They wanted a son-in-law who fit their blueprint, and I'd burned that blueprint to the ground the day I walked out of my old life. I dried my hands and stepped back into the dining room, grabbing a tray of appetizers to pass around. The crowd parted for me, but not out of respect. It was like I was invisible, just a guy with a tray they didn't need to acknowledge. I kept my head up, my smile polite, even as their voices carried over the music. He used to be something, didn't he? One of her cousins said, not bothering to lower her voice. Such a shame. I kept moving, focusing on the weight of the tray, the rhythm of my steps, anything to drown out the sting. I'd heard worse over the years, but tonight, it felt heavier, maybe because my wife wasn't there to soften it. She used to defend me, back when we were a team, but now she just stood by, letting their words land like punches I was supposed to take. I set the tray down and leaned against a pillar, stealing a moment to breathe. The restaurant was beautiful tonight, every detail exactly how I'd imagined it, the warm glow of the lights, the hum of a place that felt alive. I'd built this with my own hands, with Jonas and Priya by my side, and no one could take that away from me. But as I watched my wife laugh with her family, her back to me like I wasn't even here, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was losing something else. I'd walked away from one life to build this one, but what if the cost was her? What if the dream I'd fought for was the thing pushing her away? I told myself it was just the night talking, the weight of their judgment clouding my head. But deep down, I wasn't sure. All I knew was that I'd keep going, because this place, this life, was the only thing I had left that still felt like mine. I leaned against the kitchen counter at the Heritage, the noise of Miles's promotion party seeping through the swinging doors, a dull roar of laughter and clinking glasses that felt a world away. My hands were still damp from rinsing plates, and the air smelled of seared meat and fresh herbs, grounding me in a way the dining room never could. Out there, I was a prop in the Ashford family show, a man they barely acknowledged unless it was to point out what I wasn't. In here, I was home, surrounded by the chaos of sizzling pans and Noah's shouted orders, a place where I didn't have to prove anything to anyone. But even in the kitchen, I couldn't escape the weight of their judgment, the way it clung to me like grease I couldn't scrub off. My wife's family had never hidden how they felt about me, not since the day I walked into their lives, and tonight was just another page in a book they'd been writing for years. To them, I was the guy who didn't belong, the one who'd married their daughter and then had the nerve to choose a life they couldn't brag about. It wasn't always like this, or at least I told myself it wasn't. When I first met her parents, Dorian and Miriam, I was still in finance, wearing the right suits and saying the right things. But even then, I could feel their eyes sizing me up. They'd ask about my job, my plans, my connections, like I was auditioning for a role I hadn't signed up for. I thought marrying her would change things, that they'd see I loved her enough to build a life we both wanted. But love wasn't enough for them. It never had been. They wanted degrees framed on walls, titles that rolled off the tongue, invitations to the kind of parties where people checked your watch before they shook your hand. I didn't fit that mold, and once I left my job to start the Heritage, I might as well have painted a target on my back. A restaurant. Miriam had said once, her voice dripping with pity. That's quaint. I'd laughed it off, but the word stuck, a reminder that nothing I did would ever measure up. I grabbed a towel and wiped down the counter, more out of habit than necessity, my mind replaying the years I'd spent trying to crack their code. I'd sent gifts, bottles of wine for Dorian's birthday, flowers for Miriam, even a weekend getaway for their anniversary, all paid for out of my own pocket. I'd fixed leaks in their old house, driven across town to jumpstart their car, offered to host dinners at the restaurant just to give them a night off. Every time, I'd hoped it would shift something, that they'd see I wasn't just some guy who'd stumbled into their daughter's life. But the gifts went unmentioned, the favors forgotten, and the dinner invites brushed off with excuses about how they preferred something more formal. My wife used to smooth it over, her hand on mine, whispering that they'd come around. "They're just set in their ways," she'd say, her smile warm enough to make me believe it. But somewhere along the line, she stopped defending me and started echoing them instead, her words sharp and impatient. "Maybe if you didn't insist on doing things your way, they'd respect you more," she'd said last month, her eyes avoiding mine. I didn't know how to tell her that my way was the only thing keeping me sane. I glanced at the kitchen clock, still an hour before the party would wind down. I could hear Miles's voice through the doors, loud and smug, probably telling another story about how he'd closed some big deal. The Ashfords ate it up, their golden boy who'd checked every box they'd ever drawn. I wondered what it was like to live in a world where approval came so easy, where your worth wasn't questioned every time you walked into a room. I tried to play their game once, back when I was still in finance, sitting through dinners where they'd grill me about my career like it was a deposition. Even then, I'd felt like an outsider, my answers never quite good enough, my job never quite prestigious enough. Leaving that world was the best decision I'd ever made, but it came with a cost I hadn't seen coming, a family that treated me like I'd failed, and a wife who was starting to agree with them. I pushed off the counter and checked the dessert trays, making sure everything was ready for the next round. My wife had begged me not to host family events here, saying it made things awkward when I was working instead of mingling. But tonight wasn't my choice. Miles had picked the Heritage because it was trendy, because his clients would be impressed by the exposed brick and the craft cocktails. He hadn't asked me, just sent an email to Noah assuming I'd comp half the bill. I didn't, and I wouldn't, but I still felt the sting of being used, of knowing they only showed up here when it served their image. I wondered what they'd say if they knew how much this place meant to me, how every table, every recipe, every light in the ceiling was a piece of a dream I'd fought for. Probably nothing. They'd just roll their eyes and change the subject, like they always did when I talked about my work. I carried a tray of pastries back to the dining room, the noise hitting me like a wave as I stepped through the doors. My wife was at her parents' table now, her dress catching the light, her laugh bright and effortless. For a second, I could see the woman I'd fallen for, the one who'd believed in me when this restaurant was just a sketch on a napkin. But then she glanced my way, and her smile faltered, like she was embarrassed to see me holding a tray. I kept moving, setting plates down with a nod, ignoring the way her mother's eyes flicked over me like I was part of the decor. "Everything okay?" I asked, more out of habit than hope, and Miriam gave me a tight smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Fine, thank you," she said, her tone clipped, and I knew better than a push. I'd spent years trying to win them over, but it was like shouting into a void. Nothing came back. As I made my way back to the kitchen, I felt the familiar ache in my chest, the one that came from hoping for something I'd never get. I'd built this life to be free of their rules, to create something that mattered on my terms. But standing here, surrounded by their judgment, I couldn't help wondering if I'd made a mistake, not in choosing the Heritage, but in thinking I could keep my wife by my side while I did it. She used to be my partner, my home, but now she felt like a stranger wearing her face. I told myself it was just tonight, just the pressure of their world pressing down on us. But deep down, I wasn't sure anymore. All I knew was that I couldn't go back, couldn't be the man they wanted, because that man wasn't me. I'd keep fighting for this place, for myself, even if it meant fighting alone. I stood in the middle of the Heritage's dining room, my server's uniform sticking to my skin, holding a tray of empty glasses while the Ashford's party spun around me like a storm I couldn't escape. The air was thick with the smell of roasted lamb and red wine, but all I could focus on was the knot in my stomach, the kind that comes from knowing you're a stranger in your own house. Miles was at the center of it all, his promotion to senior partner the excuse for this whole show, shaking hands and laughing too loud, while my wife stood nearby, her eyes anywhere but on me. I wasn't supposed to be working tonight, Noah had it covered, but when he called about the staffing shortage, I pulled on the black shirt and stepped in, thinking I could help without making waves. Now, I was drowning in their stares, their whispers cutting sharper than any knife in my kitchen. I'd built this place from nothing, turned it into one of Brooklyn's best, but to them, I was just the help, a man who'd traded a future for a tray and a dream they'd never understand. I moved through the crowd, clearing plates and refilling water, my hands steady even as my chest tightened. My wife's parents, Dorian and Miriam, were at their usual table, their faces set in that familiar mix of boredom and disdain. I'd caught their comments all night, little jabs about my job, my choices, the way they said restaurant, like it was a dirty word. I learned to let it roll off me, but tonight, it was piling up, each word a brick in a wall I couldn't climb. My wife wasn't helping, she hadn't said a word to me since we got here, just gave me that look when I showed up in the uniform, the one that said I'd embarrassed her again. I wanted to grab her hand, pull her aside, ask when we'd stop being a team, but she was too busy playing the perfect daughter, the perfect sister, to notice me falling apart. I was halfway across the room when it happened. A sharp cry cut through the chatter, and I turned to see one of the new servers, a kid named Sam, frozen in place, a bottle of red wine slipping from his hands. It hit the floor with a crack, splashing across Miriam's cream-colored dress like blood on snow. The room went quiet for a split second, everyone staring as she stood up, her face twisted in fury. "You clumsy idiot," she snapped, her voice loud enough to make heads turn. Sam stammered an apology, his face red, but she wasn't listening. She was already rounding on Noah, who was rushing over with a towel. "Is this how you run a place?" she demanded. "Where's the manager? I want to speak to someone in charge." I set my tray down and stepped forward, my heart pounding, knowing I couldn't let Sam take the fall. "I'm here," I said, keeping my voice calm. "I'll take care of it." The air shifted when they realized it was me. Miriam's eyes narrowed, her lips curling like she'd tasted something sour. Dorian stood up beside her, his jaw tight, and I could feel the whole room watching, waiting for the show. "You?" she said, her voice dripping with disbelief. "You're handling this?" I nodded, grabbing a clean towel from a nearby table and offering it to her, but she swatted it away. "This is what you've become?" Miles cut in, his laugh sharp and mean, stepping closer like he was about to take a swing. "A waiter in your own house? That's rich." I felt the heat rise in my face, but I kept my eyes on him, refusing to flinch. "I'm just helping out," I said, my voice steady even as my hands shook. "Let's get you cleaned up, Miriam. We've got spare linens in the back." She didn't move, just stared at me like I was something she'd scraped off her shoe. "How shameful," she said, loud enough for everyone to hear. "My daughter married down, and this proves it." The words hit like a punch, stealing my breath, and I waited for my wife to say something, anything, to shut it down. But she just stood there, her hands clasped tight, her eyes on the floor like she was hoping it would swallow her whole. The silence was worse than the insult, a confirmation that she wasn't on my side, maybe hadn't been for a long time. I could feel the crowd's eyes on me, their murmurs starting up again, and for a moment, I wanted to drop everything, walk out, leave them to their party, their judgment, their world that had no place for me. But this was my restaurant, my home, and I wasn't going to let them chase me out. I took a breath, forcing myself to stay calm. "Sam, get a mop," I said, my voice low but firm. "Noah, bring some club soda for the dress." They moved fast, relieved to have something to do, and I turned back to Miriam. "We'll cover the cleaning," I said, knowing it wouldn't matter. She wasn't mad about the dress, she was mad about me, about what I represented, a crack in their perfect family picture. Dorian stepped closer, his voice cold. "You should have stayed in your lane, Callan. This isn't your place anymore." I wanted to laugh, to tell him this was more my place than anywhere I'd ever been, but the words stuck in my throat. Instead, I just nodded, because arguing wouldn't change them. It never had. I was about to walk away, to retreat to the kitchen and let them have their moment, when the front door opened and a ripple went through the room. I didn't know who just walked in, but the way the crowd shifted, the way Miles's face lit up, told me it was someone important. I turned, expecting another one of his clients, another suit to fawn over him, but instead, I saw a man I'd met only once before, his silver hair catching the light as he scanned the room. My heart skipped, not sure why, and I felt the air change, like something big was about to happen. I didn't know it then, but that moment was the hinge everything would turn on, the crack that would split their world wide open. All I knew was that I was still standing, still here, and for the first time all night, I wasn't sure I was ready to walk away. I stood frozen in the dining room of the Heritage, the spilled wine still pooling at my feet, Miriam's venomous words, "My daughter married down," ringing in my ears like a bell that wouldn't stop. The party had gone quiet after her outburst, every guest staring, some pretending they weren't, while my wife stood silent, her eyes fixed on the floor instead of on me. I'd been ready to walk away, to slip back to the kitchen and let them have their moment, when the front door swung open and the air shifted, like a storm breaking. I turned, expecting another of Miles's fancy colleagues, but instead, I saw Lawrence Maddox, CEO of Maddox Capital, striding in, his silver hair catching the light, his presence commanding the room without a word. I knew him, not well, but enough, and my heart gave a quick thud, though I wasn't sure why. Miles practically tripped over himself, his smug grin stretching wider as he pushed through the crowd. "Mr. Maddox, welcome," he said, voice dripping with eagerness. I reserved our best table, but the man barely glanced at him, his eyes sweeping the room until they landed on me, and then he smiled, warm and real, like we were old friends. He walked straight over, ignoring Miles's outstretched hand, and I felt the weight of every stare in the place settle on us. "Well, if it isn't the man behind the heritage," he said, his voice carrying over the hum of the party. "Callan Ward, what a surprise." He reached out, his grip firm and steady as he shook my hand, and for a moment, I forgot the tray in my other hand, the uniform sticking to my back, the sting of everything that had just happened. The room seemed to hold its breath, and I could sense my wife's family watching, their faces shifting from scorn to something I couldn't quite read. "You know him?" Miles asked, his voice cracking just enough to betray his shock. The CEO laughed, a deep, easy sound that filled the space. "Know him? He catered my wedding anniversary last fall. Best meal I've had in 20 years. I blinked, caught off guard, because I remembered that night. His wife's laughter, his quiet nod of approval as I explained the menu, but I hadn't realized it meant anything to him. I managed to smile, my voice steady despite the chaos in my head. "Glad you enjoyed it, Mr. Maddox. Means a lot." He clapped me on the shoulder, still holding my hand like we were sealing a deal. "Enjoyed it? My guests are still talking about that short rib. You've got something special here, Callan. Don't let anyone tell you different." His words hit harder than they should have, landing square in the hollow space where my wife's family's insults had been piling up all night. I glanced at her, hoping for a flicker of pride, something to show she was still with me, but her face was pale, her lips parted like she'd just seen something she couldn't explain. Miriam and Dorian were frozen at their table, their usual smugness replaced by a kind of stunned silence, and for the first time all night, I felt like I could breathe. Miles tried to recover, stepping closer, his grin forced now. "Well, that's great to hear," he said, his eyes darting between us like he was trying to solve a puzzle. "I didn't realize you two had history." The CEO turned to him, his smile polite but cool, like he was sizing him up. "History? I'd say it's more like respect. Callan's got a gift, and this place proves it." He gestured around the dining room, the oak tables, the brass lights, the open kitchen humming with life, and I felt a warmth in my chest, a reminder of why I'd fought so hard for this. I'd spent years building the heritage, pouring everything into it, and to hear someone like him say it out loud, in front of the people who'd spent all night tearing me down, was like a lifeline I hadn't known I needed. I set the tray down on a nearby table, my hand steadier now, and nodded. "Appreciate that," I said, keeping it simple because I didn't trust myself to say more. My wife's brother was still hovering, trying to insert himself into the moment, but the man wasn't having it. He turned back to me, his voice dropping to a quieter tone. "You ever think about expanding? I know some folks who'd love to invest in a place like this." It wasn't the first time someone had asked, but coming from him, it felt different, real, not just polite chatter. I shrugged, my mind racing. "Maybe someday," I said. "For now, I'm just trying to keep the lights on." He laughed again, like he knew exactly what I meant, and for a moment, it was just us, two guys talking shop, no Ashfords, no judgment, no weight of their world pressing down. The crowd was starting to buzz again, the shock of his entrance wearing off, but I could still feel their eyes on me, Miriam's pinched frown, Dorian's stiff posture, my wife's silence louder than any words. I wanted to look at her, to see if this changed anything, but I kept my focus on the man in front of me, because right now, he was the only one in the room who saw me for who I was. "You're doing more than keeping the lights on," he said, his tone serious now. "This place has soul. That's rare." I didn't know how to respond, so I just nodded, my throat tight with something I couldn't name. He glanced around, then back at me. "I'll let you get back to it. But we're having dinner here next month, my treat. You pick the menu." I smiled, a real one this time. "Deal." He gave my shoulder another pat and moved toward the table Miles had reserved, the crowd parting for him like water. I stood there, the tray forgotten, my heart pounding as the reality of what had just happened sank in. The Ashfords were watching me now, not with scorn but with something else, confusion, Maybe, or calculation. Miles's grin was gone, replaced by a tight-lipped stare, and I could almost hear the gears turning in his head, trying to figure out how I'd pulled this off. I didn't care. For the first time all night, I felt like I was standing on solid ground, like I'd been seen, not as a failure or a waiter, but as the man who'd built something worth noticing. I glanced at my wife again, hoping for a sign that she felt it too, but her eyes were on the CEO now, her hands twisting together like she was nervous. I wanted to believe it was pride, or even surprise, but the knot in my stomach told me it was something else, something I wasn't ready to face. I picked up the tray and started moving again, clearing glasses, nodding at guests, my mind replaying his words like a song I didn't want to end. The party was still alive, the laughter and chatter picking up, but it felt different now, like the air had shifted in my favor. I didn't know what would happen next, whether this would change anything with my wife's family or with her, but for now, I held on to that handshake, that moment when someone saw me for everything I'd fought to be. It wasn't much, maybe, but it was enough to keep me standing, enough to remind me why I'd chosen this life, even when it hurt. I stood near the edge of the Heritage's dining room, the weight of Lawrence Maddox's handshake still tingling in my palm, his words, "Best meal I've had in 20 years," echoing in my head like a drumbeat I didn't want to stop. The party was buzzing again, the shock of his arrival settling into a low hum of chatter and clinking glasses, but the air felt different now, charged with something I couldn't quite name. My wife's family, who'd spent all night cutting me down, were suddenly looking at me like I was a puzzle they hadn't solved. Miriam's face was tight, her usual sneer replaced by a forced smile that didn't reach her eyes, while Dorian leaned back in his chair, his arms crossed, studying me like I'd just pulled a trick he hadn't seen coming. Miles was the worst, his grin had vanished, and he kept glancing between me and his boss, who was now seated at the best table, laughing with a guest like nothing had happened. I could feel my wife watching me too, her expression caught somewhere between surprise and something heavier, but I didn't meet her eyes. Not yet. I wasn't sure I could handle what I'd see there. I grabbed a tray of empty glasses and started moving through the crowd, my hands steady even as my mind raced. The room was alive with the smell of roasted garlic and fresh bread, the kind of comfort that usually grounded me, but tonight, it wasn't enough to shake the feeling that I'd just crossed a line I couldn't uncross. The CEO's words had flipped a switch, not just for me but for everyone here, and I could sense the shift in the way people looked at me, not as the guy in the server's uniform, but as someone who mattered, someone who'd earned a nod from a man like that. It felt good, better than I wanted to admit, but it also felt fragile, like a moment that could slip away if I didn't hold it tight. I set the tray down by the bar and wiped my hands, trying to focus on the rhythm of the night, clear plates, check tables, keep moving. But my wife's family wasn't done with me yet. Miriam was the first to make a move, standing up as I passed her table, her dress still stained from the spilled wine but her posture regal, like she was about to deliver a verdict. "Well, that was unexpected," she said, her voice syrupy, like she was trying to smooth over the venom she'd spat earlier. "We're so proud of what you've done here, Callan. We were just talking about it." I stopped, my hand halfway to a glass, and looked at her, waiting for the catch. She'd called me a disgrace 20 minutes ago, said her daughter deserved better, and now she was proud? I didn't buy it, but I nodded, keeping my face neutral. "Thanks," I said, because what else was there to say? Dorian chimed in, his tone gruff but careful, like he was testing the water. "Didn't know you had connections like that." Impressive. I could have laughed. Connections? I'd met the man once, cooked for him, that was it, but I just shrugged. "Just doing my job," I said, and turned to clear another table, hoping they'd let it drop. They didn't. Miles was next, sidling up as I stacked plates, his tie loosened now, his eyes glinting with something that wasn't quite friendly. "Hey, man, that was a hell of a moment," he said, his voice loud enough to draw attention. "You should have told us you knew Maddox. I could bring some big names in here, help you grow." He leaned closer, like we were buddies sharing a secret, and I caught a whiff of whiskey on his breath. "Maybe get you a VIP card or something. Make this place a real hotspot." I set the plates down harder than I meant to, the clink cutting through his words. He was offering to help me now, after years of sneering, after laughing in my face when that wine hit his mother's dress. I wanted to tell him where he could shove his big names, but I bit it back, because this wasn't about him. It was about me, about what I'd built here, and I wasn't going to let him ruin it. My wife was watching from a few feet away, her hands twisting together, and I could tell she was waiting for me to say something, to play along with their sudden change of tune. Then she stepped forward, her voice soft but clear. Maybe you could give him a stake in the business, she said, looking at me like she was offering a gift. Just a little partnership, keep it in the family. I froze, the tray heavy in my hands, and for a second, I couldn't breathe. A partnership? With her brother, who'd spent all night mocking me, who'd never set foot in here unless it was to show off. I looked at her, really looked at her, and saw something I hadn't before, not just embarrassment or distance, but a kind of desperation, like she thought this was the way to fix everything, to make me fit into their world. That's when it hit me, sharp and clear, and I laughed, a loud, real laugh that burst out before I could stop it, echoing over the chatter. The sound stopped them cold. Miriam's smile faltered, Dorian's eyes narrowed, and Miles looked like I'd slapped him. My wife's face went pale, her lips parting, but I didn't care. I set the tray down and straightened up, feeling lighter than I had all night, like I'd finally shed something I'd been carrying too long. You're joking, right? I said, my voice steady, loud enough for the tables nearby to hear. You've spent years treating me like I'm nothing, and now, because one guy shakes my hand, you want a piece of what I built? I looked at each of them, letting the words sink in. I don't need your help. I never did. The room was quieter now, heads turning, but I wasn't done. I turned to my wife, my chest tight but my voice calm. And I don't need you to fix me. This place, this life, it's mine. If you can't see that, that's on you. I didn't wait for their response. I grabbed the tray and walked back to the kitchen, my heart pounding but my steps sure. The doors swung shut behind me, muffling the party's noise, and I leaned against the counter, the smell of thyme and butter wrapping around me like a shield. Noah glanced over from the grill, one eyebrow raised, but he didn't ask, just nodded like he knew I'd handled something big. I didn't know what would happen next, whether my wife would follow me, whether her family would double down or back off, but for the first time all night, I felt free. I'd spent years chasing their approval, trying to prove I was enough, and in one laugh, I'd let it all go. The heritage was mine, built with my hands, my heart, and no one, not even the woman I loved, could take that away. I wiped my hands on a towel and got back to work, because whatever came next, I was ready to face it on my terms. I stood behind the bar at the Heritage, wiping down the counter with a rag that didn't need to be moved, my heart still racing from the laugh I'd let out in front of my wife's family. The one that had silenced their fake smiles and left them staring like I'd grown a second head. The party was winding down now, the dining room half empty, the air heavy with the smell of coffee and leftover dessert. Lawrence Maddox was gone, his table cleared, but the echo of his handshake and his words, "You've got something special here," still hung around me, a shield against the Ashford's sudden shift from scorn to scheming. My wife was at her parents' table, her back to me, whispering something to Miriam, while Miles hovered near the door, checking his phone like he was waiting for a chance to rewrite the night. I'd said my piece out there, told them I didn't need their help or their approval, and for the first time in years, I felt like I was standing on my own ground. But the high was fading, and now I had to figure out what came next. I set the rag down and started stacking clean glasses, my hands moving on autopilot while my mind churned. My wife's suggestion, a partnership with her brother, kept replaying, each word a fresh cut. She looked at me like she was offering a lifeline, like handing over a piece of the heritage would somehow make me whole in their eyes. I wanted to believe she meant well, that she was just caught up in their world, but the truth was harder to swallow. She didn't see me anymore, not the way she used to, not the way I needed her to. I glanced at her again, her dark hair catching the light, and felt a pang in my chest, a mix of love and loss that made it hard to breathe. I'd built this place for us, for the life we dreamed of together, but somewhere along the way, she'd stopped dreaming with me. Now, she was sitting with the people who'd spent all night tearing me down, and I was here, alone, wondering if I'd been fighting for something that was already gone. The front door opened, letting in a gust of cool air, and I looked up to see Noah waving off a guest, his face tired but calm. He caught my eye and nodded toward the kitchen, a silent check-in, and I gave him a quick thumbs up, because what else could I do? I wasn't about to unload on him, not when we still had a room full of people to get through. But as I turned back to the bar, I saw Miles heading my way, his tie loose, his grin back in place like he hadn't just been schooled in front of his boss. I braced myself, knowing he wasn't done trying to claw his way into this moment. "Hey, man," he said, leaning on the counter, too close for comfort. "No hard feelings, right?" That was a big win out there with Maddox. "Let's talk business. Seriously, I could open doors for you." His voice was all charm, but his eyes were calculating, like he was already counting the profits he didn't deserve. I kept stacking glasses, my jaw tight. I said what I needed to say. I told him, not looking up. We're good. He didn't take the hint, just leaned closer, lowering his voice like we were in on something together. Come on, don't be like that. I'm just trying to help. Your family, right? That word, family, hit like a slap, and I stopped, my hand still, and looked at him. Family? He'd laughed when his mother called me a disgrace, stood by while they humiliated me in my own place, and now he was playing the brother card? I felt something snap, not loud or dramatic, but quiet, like a lock clicking shut. I straightened up, my voice low but clear. Let me make this straight. You mocked me for years, humiliated me tonight, right here at my own table, and now you want him because someone with a title shook my hand? That's not family. That's opportunism. His grin faltered, and I saw a flash of something, anger, maybe, or embarrassment, but I wasn't done. I pointed at the security monitor behind the register, its screen flickering with a grainy view of the dining room. If you, or anyone else, says another word about me or this place, I'll send the footage of what you said tonight to your boss. Every bit of it, your mother's rant, your little speech about me being a waiter in my own house. Let's see how much he values integrity in his senior staff. I didn't raise my voice, didn't need to. The words landed like stones, and I saw his face change, the color draining until he looked like he'd been caught stealing. He opened his mouth, then closed it, and for once, he didn't have a comeback. He backed off, muttering something about checking on his guests, and I watched him go, my pulse steady now, like I'd finally said what I'd been holding back for years. I turned back to the glasses, but my wife was there now, standing a few feet away, her hands clasped tight, her eyes wide like she'd just seen a stranger. You didn't have to do that, she said, her voice soft but sharp, like she was trying to keep it together. I waited for her to say more, to explain why she'd stood by while her family tore me apart, why she'd suggested giving her brother a piece of my soul, but she didn't. She just looked at me, waiting for me to back down, to smooth it over like I always did. I didn't. Yeah, I did, I said, my voice calm but final. I'm done letting you all walk over me. This is my place, my life. If you can't stand by that, we've got nothing left to say. Her lips parted, but no words came, and I saw something break in her eyes, something I couldn't fix, not tonight, maybe not ever. I walked away, back to the kitchen, the doors swinging shut behind me, muffling the last of the party's noise. Noah was there, plating the final desserts, and he didn't ask what happened, just handed me a coffee and kept working. I leaned against the counter, the warmth of the mug grounding me, and looked around at the chaos of my kitchen, the sizzling pans, the stacks of dishes, the life I'd built from nothing. My wife's family paid the bill in full, not a cent discounted, and I didn't care if they ever came back. I'd spent too long trying to fit into their world, hoping they'd see me, hoping she'd see me, but tonight, I'd drawn a line. The heritage was mine, and so was my peace. I didn't need their table, their approval, or their version of who I should be. I'd built my own, and for the first time in a long time, I felt like I could sit at it without apologizing. I sat in the quiet office at the back of the heritage, the party long over, the dining room empty except for the hum of the cleaning crew mopping the floors. My laptop was open, but I wasn't looking at the screen, just staring at the wall, my hands still, the weight of the night settling into my bones like a cold I couldn't shake. My wife's family was gone, their bill paid in full, their fake smiles and backhanded offers left behind like dirty plates I didn't want to touch. I'd stood up to them, laughed in their faces, threatened to send that security footage to Miles's boss if they pushed me again, and it felt good, sharp, clean, final. But now, in the silence, I wasn't so sure. My wife's eyes kept flashing in my mind, the way she looked at me when I'd shut her down, not just hurt but lost, like she didn't know who I was anymore. I'd drawn a line, but what if it had cut too deep? What if I'd burned something I couldn't rebuild? I leaned back in the chair, the leather creaking under me, and rubbed my face, trying to shake the fog. The office smelled faintly of coffee and old wood, a mix that always calmed me, but tonight it wasn't enough. My phone buzzed on the desk, and I glanced at it, a text from her, the first since everything went down. Mom's birthday next week. Everyone's hoping you'll come. I stared at the words, my thumb hovering over the screen, waiting for something to click, some feeling to tell me what to do. But all I felt was tired, like I'd been carrying her family's judgment for years and had only just set it down. I didn't want to go to that birthday, didn't want to sit at another table where I'd be measured and found wanting. I didn't want to pretend anymore, not for her parents, not for her brother, not even for her. I set the phone down without replying, because I didn't have an answer, not yet. I got up and walked to the window, looking out at the street, the Brooklyn night quiet except for a few passing cars. A week ago, I might have answered that text, might have gone to the birthday, brought a gift, smiled through their digs because that's what I did, kept the peace, kept her happy, kept hoping they'd change. But tonight had broken something, not just between me and them, but between me and the version of myself who'd thought I could win them over. I thought about Miriam's voice, calling me a disgrace, about Miles's laugh when he'd mocked me in my own place, about my wife's silence, louder than any insult. I thought about Lawrence Maddox's handshake, the way he'd seen what I'd built and called it special, and I realized that was enough, more than enough. I didn't need their approval, didn't need their table. I built my own, right here, and it was stronger than anything they could offer. I went back to the desk and opened a browser, not sure what I was looking for until I found it. A jewelry site, the kind my wife used to browse when we were younger, dreaming about the future. I scrolled until I saw a pearl set, $2,500, delicate and timeless, the kind of thing Miriam would wear and pretend she didn't care about. I added it to the cart, typed in her parents' address, and started writing a card in my head. Not a long one, just enough to say what I needed to say. "This is my last gift," I wrote. "I stopped being family when I stopped being useful to you." I read it over, my fingers hovering over the keys, and then hit send, the order confirmation popping up like a full stop at the end of a sentence. I didn't feel angry, didn't feel sad, just done, like I'd closed a door I'd been holding open too long. I grabbed my phone again and opened my contacts, scrolling through the names, my wife, her parents, her brother, all tied to a life I'd been trying to fit into for years. My thumb lingered over her name, her picture smiling back at me, a shot from a beach trip we'd taken before the Heritage, before things got complicated. I wanted to call her, to ask if she'd meant what she'd said about giving her brother a stake in my business, to ask if she still loved the man I'd become or just the one she'd wanted me to be. But I didn't. Instead, I blocked her number, then her parents', then Miles's, one by one, each tap like a weight lifting off my chest. It wasn't dramatic, wasn't loud, just a quiet choice to stop fighting for people who'd never fought for me. I set the phone down and leaned back, the office silent except for the faint clink of dishes being stacked outside. I stood up and walked out to the dining room, the lights dim now, the tables bare. Noah was gone, the crew wrapping up, and I was alone with the place I'd built. I ran my hand over a table, that would smooth under my fingers, and thought about the nights I'd spent here planning menus, balancing books, laughing with Jonas and Priya until dawn. This was my home, not just a restaurant, but a promise I'd made to myself, to live on my terms, to create something that mattered. I thought my wife was part of that promise, but maybe I'd been wrong. Maybe she'd never really signed on for the fight. I didn't hate her for it, didn't hate any of them, just saw it clear now, like a fog lifting. They wanted a version of me I'd left behind, and I couldn't go back, not even for her. I locked the front door and stepped outside, the night air cool against my face. The street was quiet, the neon sign above the restaurant flickering softly, and I felt a kind of peace I hadn't known in years. I'd sent the pearls, blocked the numbers, drawn the line, not out of anger, but out of clarity. I didn't need their fights, their judgments, their world. I had this one, right here, built with my own hands, and it was enough. I started walking home, my steps light, the city humming around me like it was cheering me on. I didn't know what tomorrow would bring. Maybe she'd show up, maybe she wouldn't. But for now, I was free, not just from them, but from the part of me that had kept trying to please them. The Heritage was waiting for me in the morning, same as always, and so was the life I'd chosen. I'd show up for it, like I always did, and that was all I needed to know. I stood in the dining room of the Heritage just before opening, the morning light filtering through the windows, casting long shadows across the polished oak tables I'd spent years choosing. The air smelled of fresh coffee and baking bread, a quiet promise of the day ahead, and I was alone, checking every detail, napkins folded, glasses spotless, menus stacked neat. It had been a week since the party, since I'd laughed in my wife's family's faces, sent that pearl set to her mother with a note that cut ties, and blocked their numbers without a second thought. The restaurant was my world now, more than ever, and I moved through it with a kind of calm I hadn't felt in years, like I'd finally shed a skin that never fit. I didn't feel cold or angry, just clear, like I could see my life for what it was, a table I'd built myself, one where I belonged without apologizing. I adjusted a chair, my fingers brushing the wood, and thought about the days since that night. My wife's family hadn't stayed quiet. They tried to reach me, not directly but through back channels, like I'd known they would. A friend of a friend stopped by the restaurant 2 days ago, all casual smiles, asking if I'd be at Miriam's birthday, dropping hints about how everyone missed me. I'd poured him a coffee, said I was busy, and changed the subject because I wasn't playing their game anymore. Then there were the messages on social media, vague posts from Miles about loyalty and family, probably fishing for attention, and a couple of DMs from my wife's cousins, acting like nothing had happened, asking for a reservation like I'd just hand them a table after everything. I didn't respond, didn't block them either, just let them sit, because I didn't owe them anything, not my time, not my anger, not a damn thing. I walked to the kitchen, checking the prep stations, the hum of the fridge a steady backdrop to my thoughts. Noah was already there, chopping onions with a focus that always grounded me, and he gave me a nod without breaking rhythm. "Big day?" he asked, not looking up. I shrugged, leaning against the counter. "Same as always," I said, but we both knew it wasn't true. The restaurant was busier than ever. Word had spread after the party, maybe because of Lawrence Maddox's handshake, maybe because people love a story about someone standing up for themselves. Reservations were booked out for weeks, and I'd caught a food critic sniffing around last night, scribbling notes like she was solving a mystery. It should have felt like a win, but all I could think about was the quiet, the absence of my wife's voice, her laugh, the way she used to slip in here after hours and steal a bite of whatever I was cooking. I didn't miss the fights or the judgment, but I missed her, or at least the version of her I'd loved, the one who'd believed in this place as much as I did. I grabbed a tray of dough from the fridge, kneading it slow, the rhythm pulling me back to center. People had opinions about what I'd done. Some said I was cold, cutting off her family like that, blocking her number without a word. Others said I'd finally found my spine, that I'd let them walk over me too long. Maybe both were true, but I didn't care much for the debate. I hadn't done it to prove a point or settle a score. I'd done it to survive, to protect the one thing I had left that was mine. The Heritage wasn't just a restaurant anymore. It was my home, my proof that I could build something real, something that lasted, without bending to anyone's rules. I pressed the dough flat, shaping it with steady hands, and thought about the years I'd spent chasing their approval, trying to be the man they wanted, polished, predictable, safe. I'd hated that man, and so had she, even if she wouldn't admit it now. I set the dough aside and walked back to the dining room, my shoes clicking on the floor, every sound familiar, every corner a memory. I thought about the early days, Jonas crunching numbers on a busted laptop, Priya burning her first batch of curry, me scrubbing grease off the walls until my knuckles bled. We'd laughed through it, fought through it, built something that wasn't just a business but a life. I didn't need my wife's family to see that, didn't need their names or their money or their grudging respect. I didn't even need her, not the way I used to, because I learned to stand without her, to fill the space she'd left with the work I loved. I stopped at the front window, looking out at the street, the Brooklyn morning waking up slow, and felt a quiet pride settle in, not loud or flashy, but solid, like a stone I could carry. I turned back to the room, my eyes catching the security monitor by the register, the one I'd pointed to when I'd shut Miles down. I hadn't sent that footage to his boss, didn't need to, because the threat was enough, and I wasn't in the business of ruining people, not even people who'd tried to ruin me. I'd kept it, though, a small insurance policy, a reminder that I wasn't powerless anymore. I didn't want revenge, didn't want their apologies or their guilt. I just wanted to be left alone, to walk through my days without their voices in my head. I'd spent too long letting them define me, letting their doubts creep into my work, my marriage, my dreams. No more. I had this place, this life, and it was enough, more than enough. I grabbed a cloth and started wiping down the bar, the wood gleaming under my hands, and thought about what I'd say if anyone asked why I'd done it, why I'd walked away from her family, from her. I wouldn't explain, wouldn't justify, because it wasn't about them. It was about me, about choosing a life that felt true, even when it hurt. I'd built this table, not to prove anything to anyone, but to have a place where I could sit, where I could breathe, where I could be the man I'd always wanted to be. And if you've ever been laughed at, underestimated, erased by people who were supposed to lift you, I'd tell you this. You don't need their seat, their approval, their version of who you are. You can build your own table, just like I did, and it'll be stronger than anything they could ever offer. I finished the bar and stepped back, the dining room ready, the day waiting. Noah called out that the bread was done, and I smiled, because that's how it went here, small moments, steady work, a life that didn't need to shout to matter. I didn't know if my wife would come back, if she'd try to fix things or just fade into her family's world, but I wasn't waiting anymore. I had the heritage, had Jonas and Priya, had Noah and the crew, had every guest who walked through that door looking for a meal and a story. I had myself, and that was enough to keep going, to keep building, to keep choosing this life, one day at a time. I thought it was just another routine evaluation, another box to check in the long, grueling list of duties that came with devoting 7 years of my life to Crestmont Industries. 7 years of late nights in a flickering office, cold takeout containers littering my desk while I chased down impossible deadlines. 7 years of missed anniversaries, rain-soaked commutes, and sacrifices that cost me friendships I didn't even have time to mourn. All of it, I thought, was leading somewhere. Some corner office. Some meaningful reward. Some acknowledgement that everything I poured into this company mattered. So when I straightened my tie that morning and walked into the conference room with its sterile white walls and polished glass table, I told myself to stay calm, to expect another checklist of goals and achievements. Maybe even a nod of gratitude from the man at the head of the table, Frederick Langston, my father-in-law, the king of this corporate castle. Frederick's face was unreadable as always, that craggy stone expression that gave nothing away. He sat with his hands folded neatly in front of him, the Crestmont logo gleaming on the tablet he hadn't even bothered to unlock. His voice, when it came, was a cold knife to the gut. "We're letting you go. Performance issues." At first, I thought I had misheard him. The room seemed to tilt slightly under my feet. I waited for him to explain, to elaborate, to at least offer the courtesy of pretending this was anything more than what it was, a calculated execution. But Frederick just stared, his mouth a flat line, daring me to argue. Performance issues. As if the years of blood and sweat I had given them had simply evaporated, forgotten the moment they no longer needed me. The HR manager, a woman who once praised my work ethic at company retreats, slid a folder toward me across the table. Severance terms. A confidentiality agreement. A list of things I was no longer allowed to do, to say, to be. I walked out through the glass lobby with a cardboard box in my arms and a hollow, mechanical smile on my face, exchanging forced handshakes and meaningless good lucks with people who couldn't even meet my eyes. The air outside was sharp and punishing, the winter sun glaring down with cruel indifference. I stood there for a moment, my breath misting in the cold, wondering how it could all come undone so quickly, so neatly, like I had never mattered at all. Still dazed, I got into my car and drove home, clutching the steering wheel with white-knuckled hands. I told myself Elise would understand. My wife, my partner, my anchor. She would be furious on my behalf. She would tell me that I wasn't defined by Frederick's verdict, that we would figure it out together. I rehearsed the conversation in my mind a dozen times on the drive, clinging to the hope that at least the person who loved me would stand beside me when the rest of the world turned its back. I should have known better. When I pulled into the driveway, I noticed it immediately. The house looked wrong. Silent. Still. No welcoming light in the window. No warmth waiting inside. I opened the door and stepped into the front hall, and there she was. Elise, standing like a statue by the door. Her bags were already packed, neat and efficient, like she had been planning this moment for weeks. She didn't say anything at first, just pressed a large envelope into my chest with a clinical kind of precision, as if handing off a package to a stranger. I fumbled it open with shaking fingers and found divorce papers inside. Divorce papers, a separate letter voiding the prenup clauses I hadn't noticed her quietly amending months ago, and, just to drive the knife a little deeper, a glossy brochure for a local homeless shelter. "I no longer need you," she said, her voice devoid of emotion. "You're useless now. Useless." The word rang in my ears like a gunshot. I stared at her, at the woman I had loved, the woman I had fought for, sacrificed for. And in her cold, detached gaze, I saw the truth. She had never loved me at all. I had been a tool, a means to an end, someone to lift her higher until I was no longer necessary. I didn't scream. I didn't beg. Some small, battered part of me still had enough dignity left to turn around, walk back out the door, and keep my head high. I left with nothing but a worn duffel bag, a few wrinkled clothes stuffed hastily inside, and a heart splintering quietly inside my chest. I didn't even look back as I closed the door behind me. What was there to see? A hollow house, empty of everything that once felt like home. The evening sky bled into night as I trudged to my car, my breath puffing in short, harsh clouds. I sat there for a long time, gripping the steering wheel, staring into the darkness ahead. I could almost hear the laughter, Frederick's smug satisfaction, Elise's cold triumph. They thought they had ended me. They thought they had taken everything. They were wrong. I turned the key in the ignition, the engine rumbling to life beneath me. My hands were steady now. My mind, once clouded with disbelief, sharpened into something clearer, colder. I didn't know where I was going yet, or how I would get there, but I made a silent vow right then, right there, beneath the pitiless stars. They would regret underestimating me. And when they did, it would be too late. The first night, I slept in my car. The seats were stiff and cold against my back, the windows fogged from my shallow breathing. I parked on the far side of an abandoned strip mall, where the streetlights flickered and died before reaching the cracked pavement. I pulled my old coat tighter around me and tried to find some scrap of comfort, some tiny sliver of warmth to cling to. Sleep came in fits, snatched away by every gust of wind that rattled the frame, every creak and groan of the world shifting outside. In those long, sleepless hours, I stared at the ceiling of my car and wondered how everything had unraveled so fast, how a life I built piece by piece could be dismantled with a few cold words and signatures on a page. The second night, I knew I had to do better. Pride was a heavy thing, but survival was heavier. I used a different name to rent a room in a crumbling motel on the outskirts of town, paying cash, keeping my head down. The clerk barely looked at me as he handed over a bent keycard. The room smelled of bleach and old smoke, the kind of place no one asked questions and no one remembered faces. The mattress sagged in the middle, and the air conditioner groaned like it was dying, but I stretched out and, for the first time in 2 days, let my body sink into something resembling rest. But I wasn't broken, not even close. As I lay there staring at the stained ceiling tiles, a different kind of energy crackled through my veins, sharper, colder. They thought they had gutted me, left me hollow and powerless. What Frederick, Elise, and all their sycophants didn't know was that my years at Crestmont Industries had been a calculated mask, a distraction. The mediocre performance they criticized was part of a longer game they never even glimpsed. I had spent every spare hour building something bigger, something real, hidden in the folds of shell companies and anonymous entities. Something they didn't know I controlled because they had been too busy congratulating themselves for standing above me. The truth? I owned the consulting firm that had orchestrated Crestmont's biggest victories. Every major acquisition, every lucrative merger, all steered, subtly, by hands they thought were theirs. I had built the firm quietly, patiently, moving through proxies and cutouts that insulated me from discovery. Frederick loved thinking he was the grand architect, never realizing he was a puppet dancing to the strings I pulled from the shadows. And now that they had cast me aside, thinking I was too small, too inconsequential to matter, they had cleared the field for me to act without restraint. In that dim motel room, I began to plan. I propped the rickety desk chair under the doorknob, an old habit from when I couldn't afford safety, and booted up a battered laptop I had salvaged from the trunk of my car. My fingers moved fast across the keyboard, muscle memory overriding the exhaustion tugging at my bones. First, I secured my real accounts. The ones hidden deep behind layers of offshore corporations, shell firms, and numbered trusts. I rerouted my investments into silent, liquid channels. Anything tied, even remotely, to Crestmont or Frederick's empire was isolated, drained, and shuttered without a trace. They thought they had cut down a weak man. They didn't realize they had thrown gasoline on a spark. By the third night, I wasn't sleeping anymore. I didn't need to. I thrived on the feverish energy that came from finally shedding the chains I had worn for too long. Every move I made was deliberate, calculated. A ghost slipping through the walls of the empire they believed was impregnable. I contacted old allies, people who owed me favors, debts they had never repaid. Quiet conversations in encrypted messages, midnight calls from burner phones. One by one, I activated networks they never knew existed. I closed offshore accounts that Frederick unknowingly depended on. I froze the flow of money Crestmont relied upon, assets they assumed were permanent and unassailable. I pulled threads so carefully, so invisibly, that the tapestry would not tear all at once. It would fray slowly, unraveling from within until nothing was left but ashes. They thought they exiled a pawn. They didn't realize I was the king in this game. I watched from the shadows as the first cracks began to form. Subtle at first. A delayed shipment here. A bounced wire transfer there. Just enough to plant seeds of doubt in the minds of investors and suppliers. Frederick, the great patriarch, would be too proud to see the rod until it was too late. And Elise, ever concerned with appearances, would be too busy curating her next social media post to notice the ground shifting beneath her feet. In that filthy motel room, with nothing but a duffel bag, a battered laptop, and a hunger for justice burning in my gut, I began the silent descent not into despair, but into resurrection. The world had stripped everything away, the house, the title, the marriage, the reputation. They thought I would vanish like a ghost, forgotten and discarded. But ghosts don't disappear. They haunt. And when the time was right, when the foundations they trusted crumbled into dust under their feet, they would feel my presence like a cold hand on their shoulder. They would wonder where they went wrong, when the walls began to close in, why the air grew so thin, and they would never suspect that the man they had betrayed sat patiently in the darkness, watching it all unfold with a steady hand and a heart as cold and clear as glass. This wasn't the end of my story. It was just the beginning. I disappeared. Not in a dramatic, headline-grabbing way. Not in the way Elise probably fantasized about, with some public breakdown that validated every cruel thing she ever said about me. No. I disappeared quietly, methodically, like a shadow slipping off the edge of a photograph. No angry calls. No desperate emails begging for closure. No drunken rants on social media or messages designed to spark pity. I simply vanished. To them, I became a ghost, unreachable, untraceable, and, most importantly, uncontrollable. While they basked in what they believed was their victory, I moved in silence. Every second they spent celebrating was a second I spent tightening the noose around their empire. I knew Frederick's rhythms better than he did. I knew where he hid his vulnerabilities, the shortcuts he allowed himself to take, the illegal gray areas he justified as just business. I knew which suppliers he leaned on when things got tight, which partners he placated with promises he could never fulfill. And now, without anyone to quietly smooth the cracks behind the scenes, those fractures were going to widen. Using contacts built carefully over the years, people whose loyalty I had earned not with threats or money, but with respect and results, I started rerouting investments. Some were men and women whose names Frederick barely remembered, people he dismissed as small-time players. To me, they were the scaffolding that kept Crestmont upright. They remembered who had actually made the deals happen, who stayed up past midnight fixing problems they didn't even know they had. When I called, they answered. When I asked for their help, they didn't hesitate. With a few keystrokes and quiet conversations, I began pulling strings. Offshore accounts tied invisibly to Crestmont, accounts that Frederick depended on for liquidity and leverage, started to freeze, one after another. At first, it was just a slow tightening of cash flow. A missed payment here. A shipment delay there. Things that looked like accidents to an outsider, but, to someone like me, were the first deliberate moves of a much larger plan. But I wasn't finished. I had spent years setting traps within Crestmont's infrastructure. Quiet claims of ownership buried in patent filings, licensing rights structured through third-party shells, intellectual property registered in jurisdictions they didn't even monitor. All of it legally mine, just obscured enough to let Frederick believe it was his. While he posed for magazine covers and accepted business awards, I was building a hidden foundation beneath him, one that could be ripped away with the flick of a wrist. One by one, I activated those claims. First, I froze their access to key software licenses that Crestmont needed to operate its core logistics. Then I pulled back critical consulting services that fed them proprietary market data. Contracts long taken for granted simply evaporated. Lawsuits began brewing in the background, quiet rumblings of breach and negligence that Frederick wouldn't hear until it was too late to stop them. From my newest hideout, a nondescript rental apartment 2 cities away, the kind of place where no one made eye contact in the elevator, I watched the chaos start to bloom. I didn't need to lift a finger. I had already built the machine. Now, I just let it run. They thought they had exiled a pawn. The truth was, I had been the king in this game for years. And now, freed from the shackles of pretense, I could move without caution or compromise. I didn't need Crestmont's approval. I didn't need Frederick's blessing or Elise's cold praise. I had my own empire, invisible, patient, merciless. The beauty of it was how little effort it took once the pieces were in motion. Frederick's pride made him predictable. He would blame others. He would tighten control instead of adapting. Elise, too, would follow her script, painting herself as a victim on social media, spinning narratives to shield herself from the fallout she didn't even see coming. They were creatures of habit, slaves to appearances, and they had no idea the real battle had already been lost. I moved like a ghost through their world. Silent, unseen, but everywhere. I had friends in places they never considered, people in law firms, media houses, regulatory agencies. All it took was a whisper here, a nudge there. The audits began quietly. The questions from journalists started with a trickle. By the time Frederick noticed the tide turning, it would be far too late to stem the flood. Every email they sent now went unanswered. Every number they dialed fell into the void. They reached out to mutual contacts, desperate for information, for some thread of control. Those who were loyal to me either ignored the calls or fed them just enough misinformation to keep them confused and flailing. I wasn't hiding. I was hunting. And they didn't even realize it yet. I often wondered, during those long nights, what Elise thought as she watched it unfold. She always craved status, the gleam of perfection, the validation of being envied. Watching it all slip through her fingers must have felt like drowning in slow motion. Did she blame me? Did she even realize her own betrayal had sown the seeds of her downfall? Or did she simply think the universe was punishing her, as if fate had turned its back for no reason at all? It didn't matter. I wasn't doing this for revenge. I wasn't doing it to hear them apologize or beg or offer excuses. I wasn't interested in their regrets. What I wanted, what I needed, was something far purer, the satisfaction of knowing they had destroyed themselves by underestimating the man they thought was weak. I didn't want their forgiveness. I wanted their silence, their confusion, their collapse. And so I moved, unseen, pulling the strings tighter every day, until the whole house of cards would tremble at the lightest breath. Because ghosts never scream. They just watch. And they never leave until the haunting is complete. It started small. Tiny cracks, invisible to anyone not looking closely. A late payment to a supplier here, a missed compliance update there. Things Frederick would have usually waved off with a dismissive hand, blaming an intern or a temporary system glitch. But I knew better. I watched the ripples spread across Crestmont's foundations, patient, methodical, knowing that 1,000 small cracks could bring down even the tallest tower if left unchecked. The first true sign came during what should have been a routine merger, a deal Frederick had been bragging about for months at every industry gala and boardroom lunch. At the last moment, inexplicably, the partner company pulled out. No explanation, no negotiation, just a cold email from their lawyers terminating discussions and citing concerns regarding corporate stability. Frederick must have been livid. I imagined him pacing his office, barking orders at his assistants, demanding to know why his empire suddenly seemed so fragile. Elise probably smiled awkwardly at her influencer events, pretending everything was fine while she gripped her phone under the table, texting him frantic demands for answers. But the answers wouldn't come. Not the ones they wanted. The rot had already begun, deep inside the walls they trusted to keep them safe. Suppliers, once eager to work with Crestmont, started backing out of long-term deals. Contracts that Frederick had treated as guarantees evaporated overnight. Investors, the same men and women who had once toasted his visionary leadership, began to whisper behind closed doors, questioning the financials they had never thought to scrutinize before. Emergency meetings were called. Crisis teams were assembled. Lawyers and PR firms were brought in like firefighters to a house already half-burned to the ground. Meanwhile, I stayed silent. I watched from the shadows as their empire staggered under its own weight, my hands steady, my heart cold. Frederick and Elise tried to reach me, at first politely, almost casually, as if extending a magnanimous hand to a lost child. A few emails cloaked in false concern. "We hope you're doing well. Let's talk when you're ready." When I didn't respond, the messages grew sharper, more urgent. Phone calls, voicemails, texts that flooded the burner phones I discarded as easily as a used napkin. 193 missed calls between them in 4 days. It would have been almost funny if it wasn't so pitiful. Watching them scramble, watching them realize, slowly, agonizingly, that they had made a mistake, that the man they discarded wasn't sitting quietly in a corner licking his wounds, but moving invisibly through their kingdom, pulling it apart thread by thread. And Elise, dear, cunning Elise, she played her part exactly as I expected. She took to social media like a woman possessed, spinning a web of carefully curated lies. She painted herself as the betrayed one, the wounded survivor of some unseen cruelty. Tearful selfies, long captions about healing and moving on from toxic relationships. Pictures of her smiling bravely with friends, attending charity galas, vacationing on tropical beaches. All staged, all hollow. I recognized the desperation beneath the gloss, the frantic need to control the narrative before the truth leaked out and poisoned the perfect image she had built. But no amount of filters or hashtags could save her from what was coming. What they didn't know, what they couldn't see, was that every move they made was still part of my plan. Every post Elise uploaded, every press statement Frederick issued, every panicked meeting they held behind closed doors, I saw it all. I had people inside their circles, people who owed me favors, or who simply didn't like them enough to stay loyal when the ship started sinking. I didn't even have to ask. The information flowed to me naturally, like blood leaking from a wound. I was everywhere, and nowhere. I didn't need to gloat. I didn't need to show up and shout, "I told you so," in their faces. That would have been too small, too petty. I wasn't interested in petty victories. I was building something bigger, a quiet, unstoppable reckoning. And the beauty of it was that they wouldn't even realize I was behind it until the final blow fell. There's a kind of exquisite cruelty in letting someone build their own gallows, watching them hammer the nails and tie the rope with their own eager hands. That was what I was doing, giving them the rope, letting them swing. I drove past Crestmont's headquarters once during those early days, just to see it with my own eyes. The building was still gleaming, the flags still snapping in the wind. On the surface, everything looked normal, business as usual. But I could feel the sickness festering inside those walls, could almost taste the fear starting to seep into the air. The security guard at the gate didn't recognize me. Or maybe he did and looked away. Either way, I didn't stop. I didn't need to. I had already set the fire. Now I was just waiting for the smoke to rise. As the days turned into weeks, the panic spread faster. Suppliers demanded payment up front instead of trusting long-standing agreements. Investors canceled meetings, citing scheduling conflicts. A major client terminated their contract without warning, a loss that would bleed millions from Crestmont's quarterly report. Frederick and Elise must have been scrambling to patch the leaks, to reassure everyone that everything was fine, that they were still in control. But control is a fragile illusion. Once it cracks, once the doubt sets in, it spreads like a virus. And no amount of charm or money can cure it. I wasn't just tearing down their empire. I was erasing the myth of their invincibility, exposing them for what they had always been, frauds, propped up by arrogance and stolen work, too blind to see the hand that had fed them until it withdrew. I watched. I waited. And I smiled. Because the panic had only just begun. The tipping point came on a gray, brittle morning, one of those days where even the sun seemed reluctant to rise. It was board meeting day, the one Frederick had called in a desperate bid to calm the investors, to patch the widening cracks in Crestmont's polished facade. I wasn't there, of course. I didn't need to be. My presence would have been too loud, too obvious. Instead, I sent someone better, a proxy, a quiet hammer in a tailored suit who would drive the final nail into the coffin without ever raising his voice. They didn't notice him at first when he walked into the boardroom, a manila folder tucked casually under his arm. He wasn't part of their usual entourage. He didn't belong to any firm they recognized. Maybe for a second, they thought he was an auditor or a compliance officer, someone easy to ignore. But when he laid the dossiers neatly in front of each board member, when he uttered the simple phrase, "I suggest you read carefully before today's vote," the room changed. Inside those plain folders was everything. Proof of Frederick's financial manipulations, the cooked books, the creative accounting he had relied on to maintain Crestmont's image of unstoppable growth. The forged documents, the backdated contracts, the hidden debts. I had gathered it all carefully over years, a slow accumulation of evidence, tucked away and untouched until the moment was right. There were copies of leaked messages, two texts and emails between Frederick and Elise, candid and damning, revealing the full extent of their plan to oust me. How they laughed at my supposed loyalty. How Elise gloated about keeping me in the dark, about playing me like a fool until the moment she could cut the rope and watch me fall. And perhaps most satisfying of all, the contracts, real, notarized, legally binding, showing that critical pieces of Crestmont's infrastructure, the patents and consulting services they depended on, weren't theirs at all. They were mine, had been mine for years, hidden behind layers they never cared enough to investigate. It took less than an hour. Less than an hour for Frederick's empire to start crumbling in the faces of men and women who had once cheered him on stage. I imagined the silence that must have filled that room, the frozen expressions, the way the board members glanced at one another, seeing for the first time not a titan of industry, but a desperate old man clinging to the wreckage of his lies. Reports later said Frederick turned pale, that his hands shook as he tried to explain, tried to spin the story. But there's a kind of truth that can't be out-talked, can't be massaged into something prettier. Cold, hard facts laid bare don't need embellishment. They do their work all on their own. Outside, the markets began to move almost immediately. Word traveled faster than wildfire through investor circles, through the press, through the industry. Crestmont stock, once a steady rock, began to hemorrhage value by the hour. Suppliers cut ties, fearful of the fallout. Clients demanded audits and emergency renegotiations. Competitors circled like sharks drawn to blood in the water. And all the while, my phone buzzed relentlessly against the cheap laminate table of the coffee shop where I sat, miles away, sipping burnt coffee and watching the collapse unfold across news tickers and frantic email leaks. Call number 194 came from Elise. I stared at the screen for a long moment as it vibrated in my hand, her name flashing across the display like some cruel joke. Part of me, some raw, battered piece, almost answered. Not because I wanted to hear her voice, not because I missed her, but because some old instinct wanted to see the panic in her words, to hear the fear she had never thought she would feel. But I didn't. I let it ring. Let her voice slide unanswered into the digital void, just another ghost in the machine. She didn't deserve an audience. Not anymore. Instead, I finished my coffee, pushed the cup aside, and rose to leave, the sun finally breaking weakly through the clouded sky. I had places to be, plans to continue, and I wasn't about to waste another second on people who had thrown me away the moment they thought I was no longer useful. They had played their part. Their downfall was underway. Now it was time for me to finish building something better. As I stepped into the thin winter light, I didn't feel anger. I didn't even feel triumph, not in the cartoonish way some might imagine. There was no laughter, no fist-pumping, no shouting to the heavens that I had won. What I felt was something quieter, deeper, a clean, cold satisfaction that settled into my bones. Justice didn't always come with fireworks and applause. Sometimes, it came with silence, with a slow, inevitable collapse that no one could stop once it began. And I had all the time in the world to watch it happen. Betrayal doesn't age well under the spotlight. It rots from the inside out, faster than even the betrayer expects. Elise had built her entire life around appearances, meticulously crafted Instagram posts, charity gala photos, magazine mentions that lauded her as a rising socialite. Every smile she wore was rehearsed. Every moment she shared was filtered, staged, performed for an audience hungry for envy. But now, with the truth leaking out like water through a cracked dam, her perfect facade was crumbling, and the audience she once courted turned their gaze elsewhere, cold and merciless. It started subtly, the way these things always do. Designers who once scrambled to dress her for events suddenly regretted to inform her they had nothing available in her size. Friends who used to flood her comment sections with heart emojis and adoration grew strangely silent. The curated invitation slowed, then stopped. Brands severed her influencer partnerships overnight, citing internal policy shifts and brand image concerns. And no one, not one of those glittering friends, not one of the eager assistants or PR managers, offered her a hand as she fell. Screenshots of her old, boastful texts leaked to the media, messages dripping with contempt for the people she pretended to love. Comments about manipulating me, about laughing at how easily she had me fooled, surfaced in forums and gossip sites, then real news outlets. The sympathy she had so desperately tried to build melted away like frost in the sun. Now she wasn't a survivor. She was a schemer, a climber, a fraud. Public perception didn't just shift, it shattered. And I didn't lift a finger. I simply watched, detached, from another city, already miles ahead while she flailed in a world she had once commanded. One night, weeks after the dossiers had detonated the last of Crestmont's credibility, she tried to find me. Word got back to me through a friend who still ran a few security details around town. Elise had shown up at the dingy motel where I had spent those first brutal nights, the one I'd left behind long before. She pounded on doors, screaming my name into the empty corridors, waking up drifters and desperate men who had no idea who she was. Hair tangled, makeup smeared, voice hoarse with panic. I wasn't there. I hadn't been there in months. While she raged at ghosts, I was sitting in a polished glass tower across the country, my suit freshly pressed, my voice calm as I presented to a room full of new investors. Men and women whose portfolios dwarfed anything Crestmont had ever touched. Titans of tech, real estate, manufacturing, people who understood value, people who had seen the reports of what I had orchestrated and wanted a piece of whatever came next. The irony wasn't lost on me. The life Elise and Frederick had thrown me out of, the one they thought they controlled, had been nothing but the starter pistol. What I was building now wasn't revenge. It wasn't even redemption. It was rebirth. On a scale they could have never imagined, much less touched. Sitting across from billionaires in sleek conference rooms, discussing plans that would ripple across industries for decades, I realized something Elise would never understand. You don't rebuild by clinging to what was lost. You rebuild by becoming something so much bigger that the old wounds can't even reach you anymore. Meanwhile, Elise's life shrank. Her world, once so wide and full of shallow adoration, contracted like a dying star. She posted fewer photos. She attended fewer events. Her name dropped off the society pages. Even her most desperate attempts, crying interviews with second-rate talk shows, heartfelt apologies crafted by PR teams, fell flat. The public had moved on. They always do. She became an afterthought, a footnote, a warning. I thought, for a moment, about what it must feel like to be abandoned by the very people you once thought you controlled. To look around and realize that without your illusions, you were nothing but a hollow shell. I thought about the night she had shoved that envelope into my chest, her bags already packed, her voice dripping with disdain. I thought about the brochure for the homeless shelter she had tossed at me like I was garbage to be disposed of neatly. And then I smiled. Because now, when she reached for help, when she called out into the void she had helped create, all she found was silence. The same silence she had left me with. And I didn't need to lift a hand to punish her. The world had done it for me. I moved through those days with a quiet certainty, focused only on what was ahead. Elise's fall was not my concern anymore. I had a new life to build, and it didn't have room for old ghosts. There were meetings to attend, partnerships to forge, skyscrapers to put my name on. I didn't glance back. I didn't check her social media. I didn't follow the tabloids. If her name appeared in a headline, I skipped past it the same way you might ignore an ad for something you no longer wanted. Elise had made her choices, and now she lived with them, just as I was living with mine, stronger, sharper, and freer than I had ever been under her shadow. Somewhere, in some empty hotel room or rented apartment, maybe Elise sat with her phone in hand, scrolling through memories she couldn't reclaim. Maybe she whispered my name into the dark, hoping for an answer. But there would be none. I had already answered the only way that mattered. By leaving her behind with nothing but the echoes of the life she lost. Frederick Langston had always walked like a man who owned the ground he stepped on. Chest out, chin high, eyes scanning the world with a look that said, I built this, and I dare you to question it. Even in boardrooms where billion-dollar deals hung in the balance, he carried himself with a casual arrogance, confident that no one could touch him. For years, that confidence had been his armor, and, in many ways, his weapon. But pride, when worn too long, becomes brittle. And the world he thought he ruled had already started crumbling beneath him long before he noticed. It didn't happen with a dramatic explosion. Frederick's fall was slower, more humiliating. Like a man bleeding out from wounds he couldn't see. The banks were the first to turn on him. One by one, institutions that had once fought for a seat at his table began issuing demands instead of invitations. Letters once written in flowery corporate politeness now arrived stamped with urgency, repayment clauses triggered, lines of credit suspended, audits demanded. At first, Frederick must have believed it was a mistake, some glitch in the system. Maybe he barked orders at his CFOs, demanded explanations from his accountants, threw tantrums behind closed doors. But money doesn't make mistakes. Money listens to fear. And the financial world was scared of what Crestmont had become. Then came the investors, the lifeblood of any corporate giant. The same men and women who had once toasted Frederick's visionary leadership with champagne now arranged private meetings without him. Emergency sessions filled with whispered calculations and contingency plans. They smelled the rot, and loyalty evaporated faster than spilled wine on a hot sidewalk. When the board called an unscheduled vote of no confidence, Frederick must have realized, finally, that no amount of bluster would save him. I imagined him standing there in that vast, cold boardroom, where sunlight slashed across polished tables and walls lined with plaques that praised him for achievements he had barely earned, watching the hands rise against him. Some out of fear, some out of opportunity, but most out of the simple human instinct to abandon a sinking ship. The official story spun to the press was almost laughable. Frederick Langston was stepping down to focus on his health and family. A carefully crafted statement, delivered with the trembling dignity of a man who had no other choice. Behind the scenes, it wasn't dignity that moved him. It was survival. Resignation was the only card he had left to play to stave off lawsuits, criminal investigations, complete annihilation. And still, even stripped of his crown, Frederick tried to reach for me. The final message came on a rainy Thursday, my phone buzzing with a number I knew by heart but hadn't dialed in months. For a moment, I just stared at it, the memory of all those years surging up like a bitter tide, years of working late to hit impossible deadlines, of sacrificing time, health, love just to prove myself worthy in his eyes. Eyes that had never once looked at me and seen anything more than a pawn. I let the call go to voicemail. Later, when I played it back, the message was short. No anger. No threats. Just a ragged voice, heavy with defeat. Please, let's talk. That was all. Not an apology. Not a confession. Just a hollow plea from a man who finally understood that power, once lost, couldn't be summoned back by simply asking nicely. I didn't respond. Some things deserve silence more than revenge. And Frederick Langston's fall was too complete, too inevitable, to require anything from me now. I imagined him alone in that grand, empty house Elise once paraded through Instagram stories, the chandeliers throwing cold light over rooms stripped of purpose. I imagined the wine cellars he no longer stocked, the closets full of designer suits he no longer had reasons to wear. I imagined him sitting at a massive oak desk, the same one he used to lecture me across, now covered in unpaid bills and subpoenas instead of quarterly reports. There was no need to say anything. My silence was louder than any victory speech could ever be. Frederick had spent his life building walls so high that he couldn't even see the people he crushed beneath them. And now, at the end of it all, he found himself trapped inside those same walls, abandoned by the very empire he thought would outlive him. He had miscalculated. Not just about the markets, not just about the loyalty of investors, but about me. He had mistaken quiet for weakness, loyalty for stupidity, patience for impotence. He had trained his whole life to defeat men who charged at him with swords drawn, never realizing that the greatest threat was the one who smiled, knelt, played the game, and then dismantled the battlefield itself. I didn't celebrate Frederick's fall. I didn't need to. Real victories don't taste like champagne or gunpowder. They taste like air after a storm of sharp, clean, electric with possibility. They feel like freedom in your bones, like standing at the edge of a world that finally belongs to you. I slid my phone back into my pocket, letting the rain wash over me as I walked away from the cafe where I had heard the voicemail. The city stretched out around me, alive with 1,000 new beginnings. Deals to be made, futures to shape, battles to win. And somewhere, back in the ruins of Crestmont, Frederick Langston stared into the ashes of everything he had built, realizing too late that the pawn he had discarded had never been a pawn at all. I had always been the architect. I had always been the storm. Under my real name, Julian Blackwood. I stepped out of the ashes of the life they tried to bury me in and into the world I had always been meant to shape. No more hiding behind shell companies. No more masks or false modesty. I unveiled Vanguard Horizons to the world like a king revealing a sword long hidden in stone. A consultancy firm? On paper, yes. But Vanguard Horizons was far more than that. It was a living machine, an entity built not to survive inside the old system but to outthink it, outmaneuver it, devour it. At the press conference, the cameras flashed in furious bursts as I stood at the podium, calm and deliberate. Behind me, the sleek new logo shimmered across a massive digital screen, a stylized V cutting cleanly through a rising sun. Symbolic, maybe even poetic, but make no mistake, Vanguard was a weapon, a sharpened one. The headlines came fast and loud. Phantom genius reshapes industry. Unknown power broker unveils Vanguard Horizons. Tech giants back new consulting titan. I didn't correct them. I didn't sit for interviews explaining where I'd been or why no one had heard of me before now. I let the mystery feed the momentum. People are drawn to shadows, to stories half told. They built their own legends around my name, and I gave them just enough fuel to keep the fire burning. The first deals closed within weeks. Major tech firms, real estate moguls, private equity groups, they came to me with their tangled messes, their impossible ambitions, and I gave them clarity, strategy, power. Where Crestmont had bloated itself on arrogance, Vanguard thrived on precision. Every move was calculated, every partnership surgical. I wasn't trying to be everything to everyone. I was building alliances that mattered, futures that would last. And the clients Frederick had once considered his personal property? They defected in waves. It started quietly at first, emails sent late at night, whispered conversations in the backrooms of galas and retreats. CEOs and founders realizing that the man behind their best successes hadn't been Crestmont after all. It had been me. They came not just for the results, but for the chance to be part of something alive, something inevitable. One by one, they signed. One by one, the pillars of Crestmont's influence crumbled into dust. Every deal I closed didn't just build Vanguard. It erased another piece of the empire that had tried to erase me. And the city skyline, the same skyline I had once glimpsed with longing as I burned midnight oil in a borrowed office, began to change. New towers rose with Vanguard's imprint hidden in their blueprints. Infrastructure projects, data hubs, luxury developments, they all bore my fingerprints now, invisible but undeniable. I would walk through the financial districts, past glass giants gleaming in the sun, and feel the weight of it. The quiet knowledge that while others saw buildings, I saw battlefields I had already conquered. I didn't just climb back up the mountain. I rebuilt the entire mountain under my name. I didn't need grand gestures. No petty revenge campaigns. No need to flaunt my success in Frederick's or Elise's faces. Their worlds had already shrunk to the point where they couldn't touch mine even if they screamed my name into the wind. Still, from time to time, I heard whispers. Elise's desperate attempts to cling to relevance, launching a half-hearted lifestyle brand that failed before it even truly launched. Frederick's lawsuits, thrown out one after another, as he tried in vain to claw back something he had never truly owned. None of it mattered. Their downfall had been finalized the moment they tried to bury a man who had already outgrown their graves. I lived differently now, not in garish displays or golden palaces. My home was a penthouse in a tower I had helped design, overlooking the city from a height that seemed almost unfair. Floor-to-ceiling glass walls bathed the rooms in light during the day, and at night the entire skyline blinked like a galaxy at my feet. It wasn't about wealth. It wasn't about proving anything. It was about breathing air that tasted of freedom, of standing in a life I had built with no debts, no chains, no apologies. There was a peace in that kind of success, an unshakable peace that no amount of betrayal could steal back. In the quiet hours, I would sit out on the terrace, the city humming below me, and think about the path that had led here. Not with bitterness, not with regret, but with a kind of wonder. Every setback, every betrayal, every night spent sleeping in a cold car, every door slammed in my face, every bitter lesson learned. They had all been necessary. They had all been building me into the man I was now. Julian Blackwood wasn't a victim of Crestmont. He was the architect of its ending. And Vanguard Horizons was only the beginning. The world didn't even realize yet how much it was about to change. But they would. Soon enough. 6 months later, almost to the day, she found me. It was a crisp afternoon, the kind that smelled faintly of autumn and ambition. I was sitting at a small cafe tucked against the edge of a bustling plaza, sipping a black coffee and reviewing project notes on my tablet when I caught the movement in the corner of my eye. I looked up, and there she was. Elise. She hesitated at the entrance for a moment, clutching her handbag with a white-knuckled grip, scanning the tables until her eyes locked onto mine. When she moved toward me, it wasn't with the same breezy confidence she used to command rooms with. No, this was a different woman altogether. Her steps were unsure, almost clumsy. Her clothes were still designer, but they didn't carry the same shine, the same whisper of privilege. Her hair was styled, but not quite perfectly. The armor of perfection she once wore had cracked in 100 places, and now all I could see was the fear she tried so hard to hide. She stopped at my table, swallowing hard before speaking. Her voice was thinner than I remembered, softer, like it could blow apart with a single breath. "Julian," she said, "please, can we talk?" I set the tablet down slowly, letting the silence stretch between us. A few heads turned at nearby tables, sensing the tension, the familiarity of two people standing on opposite sides of a war that had already been lost. I gestured to the seat across from me without a word. Let her make the choice. Let her sit in the aftermath she created. She slid into the chair, setting her bag on her lap like a shield. For a moment, she just looked at me, really looked, searching for the man she thought she knew, the man she had shaped and discarded like a tool past its usefulness. But that man was gone. And the one sitting in front of her now didn't belong to her memory, or her guilt, or her regret. Tears welled in her eyes almost immediately. "I made a mistake," she whispered, voice cracking. I thought I was doing what was best for me. I didn't realize how much She trailed off, wiped at her eyes with shaking fingers. I watched without emotion, sipping my coffee as she floundered. I miss you, she finally said. We can start over. Please, Julian. I've changed. I see it now. We were good together. We can be again. The scent of her perfume drifted across the table, familiar, weaponized. The same fragrance she wore the night we first met at a Crestmont gala. The same scent that once twisted my stomach with longing. She was trying to pull me back into a memory, trying to tether me to something that no longer existed. I set the cup down carefully, folded my hands on the table, and leaned forward just slightly. You fell in love with a mask you made for me, Elise, I said, my voice calm, clear. You never loved the real man. You loved the version you could control. The one you thought you could shape into whatever suited your next ambition. She shook her head frantically, lips parting in protest, but I held up a hand and she froze. The man sitting across from you now? I continued. You don't even know him. You never bothered to know him. And the truth is, he doesn't know you anymore either. Her face crumpled, her shoulders collapsing inward as the last of her carefully rehearsed arguments died on her tongue. She realized it then, truly realized, that there was no coming back. No reset button. No forgiveness waiting in the wings. What we had wasn't sleeping beneath the surface, waiting for her to wake it up. It was gone, burned away by every cruel word, every calculated betrayal. I stood up slowly, gathering my tablet and jacket in a quiet, deliberate motion. She stared up at me, blinking fast, as if she couldn't believe I was really walking away. As if she thought the right words would fall from the sky and fix everything before it was too late. But life doesn't work that way. Not for people like her. Not anymore. I tucked the chair back under the table, nodded once, polite, final, and left her there, sitting in a sea of strangers who didn't care who she used to be, who wouldn't stop to ask why the beautiful woman at the corner table was weeping into a designer scarf. As I stepped into the sunlight, the world felt sharper, clearer. The city moved around me, alive and indifferent, and I felt no anger, no sorrow, no longing, just freedom. I had already said everything that needed to be said, not with words, but with the life I had built without her. I didn't look back. I didn't need to. Somewhere behind me, Elise clutched at memories that could no longer touch me, and I walked forward into a future that belonged only to me. I live quietly now, not hidden, not diminished, just apart. There's a difference. I don't crave the spotlight the way Frederick did, basking under the heat of attention until it seared him. I don't need applause or fanfare. Power, real power, doesn't announce itself with flashing lights and roaring crowds. It moves like a current beneath the surface, silent and inescapable. Every contract I sign, every building that rises from blueprints I once sketched in the loneliness of those lost years, every company I touch, all of it carries a reminder of who I am now. Vanguard Horizon stretches like an unseen hand across industries and borders, influencing boardroom decisions and government policies, moving billions with a whisper. I don't need my name on every door. I don't need statues erected in my honor. The mark I leave is in the way the world bends slightly, quietly, around the things I build. Sometimes, I catch glimpses of the echoes I've left behind. A news article mentioning Vanguard's latest acquisition. A skyline punctuated by a tower whose foundations I laid. A policy shift in a company once considered immovable. Each one a testament not to revenge, but to resurrection. To the simple, unshakable truth that no betrayal, no exile, no heartbreak could destroy what I carried inside me all along. The man they discarded, the man Elise shoved out the door without a second thought, the man Frederick dismissed with a cold nod, became the architect of their downfall without ever needing to lift a hand in rage. Sometimes, I wonder if they see it. If Elise, sitting alone in some smaller, dimmer apartment than she once imagined for herself, opens her newsfeed and feels that cold pang of recognition when my name flickers by. If Frederick, in the lonely echo of his empty mansion, still pretends that it was luck, or timing, or some other excuse that dismantled the empire he thought was invincible. I like to think they do. Not because I want them to suffer, not anymore, but because there's something fitting, something poetic, about knowing they are haunted not by anger, but by the shadow of what they lost. I don't seek them out. I don't monitor their downfall like a voyeur sipping champagne. I have no need. Their defeat was inevitable, written the moment they chose betrayal over loyalty, arrogance over wisdom. My legacy isn't in their ruin. It's in the empires I build now, the lives I change, the future I shape. I live simply in a way few would understand. My penthouse is elegant, but not ostentatious. My clothes are tailored, but unremarkable. My days are filled with creation, not conquest. Because true power doesn't scream. It whispers. It moves patiently, inexorably, through the world, unseen by those too blinded by their own vanity to recognize it. I keep a small study at the heart of my home, lined with dark wood and old books. Not the flashy trophies of success, but the heavy, grounding kind. The ones that remind you of how many lives came before you, how many wars were fought in silence. I sit there often at night, the city stretched out before me like a living map, and I think about the path I walked to get here. Would I have chosen it if I had known how much it would cost? Would I have still loved Elise, still trusted Frederick, still believed in a world that rewarded loyalty? Maybe. Maybe part of growing stronger isn't erasing who you were, but carrying it with you like a scar, something that hurt once but no longer defines you. I am not the man they tried to break. I am the man forged in the fires they lit around me. There's a freedom in that, a peace they will never know. I get letters sometimes, offers, invitations, attempts to pull me back into the games I once played. High-profile galas, exclusive memberships, boards seeking a figurehead to parade. I decline most of them, politely, firmly. Let others chase titles and headlines. I have no need to stand in the spotlight when I can move the world from the shadows. Because in the end, that's my legacy. Not loud, not obvious, but undeniable. A quiet, unstoppable force reshaping the world long after those who tried to destroy me have been forgotten. And somewhere, late at night, when the city is hushed and the skyline blinks like distant stars, I know that Elise and Frederick, wherever they are, still feel it. Still remember the man they cast aside, the shadow they thought would vanish. But shadows don't vanish. They linger. They grow. They become the very foundation upon which new empires rise. I lean back in my chair, the soft hum of the city below like a heartbeat in my ears, and I smile, not in triumph, but in understanding. The legacy I leave behind isn't carved in marble or broadcast in headlines. It's carved into the bones of the world they once thought they ruled. And it will endure, long after the last of their names has faded into silence. It's funny how a moment you've imagined 1,000 times can shatter into a nightmare in an instant. My wedding day, the day I thought would be the beginning of a perfect life with the woman I loved, was anything but perfect. As I stood at the altar, feeling the weight of every vow I was about to make, Sarah stood beside me, radiant in her gown. Her smile looked perfect, but now I wonder if it had been rehearsed. The ceremony started beautifully. My parents beamed with pride. My friends exchanged knowing winks, and the air was thick with the kind of joy you only find at weddings. I should have known something was off when Sarah's hand trembled in mine. I chalked it up to nerves. Who wouldn't be nervous on their wedding day? But the tremble wasn't nerves. It was guilt, betrayal, and something far colder. The priest's words echoed in the hall. "Do you, Sarah, take this man to be your lawfully wedded husband?" Her lips parted, but the words that came out weren't the ones anyone expected. She stepped back, releasing my hand, and looked at me, not with love, but with pity. "I can't do this," she said. For a moment, I thought she meant she couldn't handle the emotions of the day. Maybe she was overwhelmed. Maybe I'd misunderstood. But then she turned, her voice steady and clear, and pointed toward the audience. "This is Andrew's moment now." The room froze. My brother Andrew stood, his confident smirk carving its way across his face as he walked toward us. I stared at him, and then at Sarah, unable to process what I'd just heard. Was this a joke? Some kind of bizarre prank? But the way Andrew stood tall, the way Sarah's eyes lit up when she looked at him, it all hit me like a sledgehammer. "Why don't you join the audience, Michael?" Sarah added, her voice sharp and commanding. "This is where you belong." Her words gutted me. The world around me became a blur of whispers and gasps as the guests processed what had just happened. I was frozen in place, a spectacle in my own tragedy. People I'd known for years, the same people who had congratulated me on my engagement, now looked at me with a mix of pity and disbelief. My parents were too shocked to move, my friends too horrified to speak. Andrew, my alpha brother, the golden child who could do no wrong, stood beside Sarah as if he belonged there. His smirk deepened, and I wanted nothing more than to knock it off his face. But I didn't. Not yet. No, I needed to keep my composure. I could feel the weight of every eye in the room, every judgment and assumption. Losing control now would hand them the victory they craved. Is this some kind of joke? I asked, my voice calm despite the storm raging inside me. Sarah tilted her head, her expression almost mocking. It's no joke, Michael. Andrew and we're in love. This wedding was a mistake. Andrew chimed in, his voice dripping with arrogance. Step aside, little brother. You wouldn't want to ruin our big day. Our big day. The audacity of it made my blood boil. I clenched my fists, every muscle in my body screaming for me to lash out, but I forced myself to breathe. My entire life had been a series of battles against Andrew, fighting for recognition, for approval, for a place in the family that wasn't overshadowed by his larger-than-life presence. And now, here he was, stealing the one thing I thought was mine alone. But this wasn't the time for anger. No, anger would only make me look like the fool they wanted me to be. If they thought I'd crumble under the weight of their betrayal, they were wrong. I straightened my back, adjusted my tie, and smiled. An expression so calm it wiped the smirk off Andrew's face. By all means, I said, stepping aside and gesturing to the priest. The stage is yours. Enjoy it. The room erupted into chaos. Guests whispered furiously, some standing in shock, others rushing to me with concerned murmurs. But I didn't pay them any mind. I walked calmly to an empty seat in the front row, my head held high, and sat down. If Sarah and Andrew thought they'd humiliated me, they hadn't seen anything yet. From the corner of my eye, I saw Sarah hesitate. Andrew's confident posture faltered. They expected me to lash out, to cry, to storm out of the church in a fit of rage. But instead, I was a statue of composure, an immovable force amidst the chaos they'd created. As they fumbled to explain themselves to the priest, as the guests continued to murmur and point, I leaned back in my chair and crossed my arms. This wasn't over, not by a long shot. They thought they'd won, that they'd stripped me of my dignity and walked away victorious. But I had something they didn't, patience. And when my next move came, they wouldn't know what hit them. Looking back, I can't say the betrayal came out of nowhere. No, the signs were there, subtle but insidious, like cracks in a mirror that only become obvious when the glass shatters. But when you're in love, you're blind to the small things, too busy convincing yourself that everything is perfect to notice the fractures forming. Sarah and I met through a mutual friend. From the moment she walked into the room, I was smitten. She had this way of making you feel like you were the only person in the world. Her laugh infectious, her smile intoxicating. I fell hard, and before long, she was the center of my universe. My friends warned me that things were moving too fast, that Sarah was too good to be true. I brushed them off, calling them jealous or overprotective. I trusted her completely, and for a while, it seemed like she trusted me too. Then there was Andrew, my older brother. Andrew, the golden child, the man who could do no wrong. Where I was careful and methodical, Andrew was bold and impulsive. He had this magnetic charm that drew people in, but it also masked his darker side. Growing up, I'd lived in his shadow, always striving for the approval that came so easily to him. But as we got older, I thought we'd moved past the rivalry. I thought we were finally brothers, not competitors. Andrew was around a lot in the months leading up to the wedding. He was always stopping by, offering unsolicited advice about the venue or the guest list, cracking jokes about how he'd make a better groom. "Relax, Mikey," he'd say, patting me on the back. "I'm just kidding." And I'd laugh, because Andrew was always joking. At least, I thought he was. But there were moments that didn't sit right with me. Moments when I'd catch him and Sarah exchanging looks or laughing about something I wasn't in on. I told myself I was imagining things. Sarah loved me. Andrew was my brother. Why would they ever betray me? The truth started to creep in slowly, like shadows stretching at dusk. Sarah began acting distant, her excuses for avoiding me piling up. "Work's been crazy," she'd say, or "I just need some space to decompress." I wanted to believe her, to trust that she was just stressed about the wedding. But the way she looked at me, it wasn't the same. Her smile no longer reached her eyes, and her touch felt like an obligation rather than a desire. Andrew's behavior changed too. He stopped with the jokes and started offering Sarah more attention than I was comfortable with. At family dinners, he'd pull out her chair or pour her wine. Small gestures that shouldn't have meant anything but did. When I confronted him about it, he laughed it off. "You're being paranoid, little brother," he said, his grin smug and unbothered. "Sarah's like family now." But the worst part? I wanted to believe him. I wanted to believe that I was overthinking things, that the nagging feeling in my gut was nothing more than pre-wedding jitters. After all, why would Sarah choose Andrew over me? We were planning a life together. She loved me, or at least, she said she did. Then came the night before the wedding. Sarah was out with her bridesmaids, celebrating her last night as a single woman. I stayed home, going over the vows I'd written and double-checking the details for the big day. Andrew dropped by unannounced, a bottle of whiskey in hand and a smug look on his face. "One last drink before you're a married man," he said, pouring us each a glass. We sat in silence for a while, the tension between us palpable. I wanted to ask him about Sarah, about the strange moments I'd noticed, but I didn't. Maybe I was afraid of what he'd say. Maybe I didn't want to give voice to my doubts. Instead, I raised my glass and said, "Here's to tomorrow." Andrew clinked his glass against mine, his smirk widening. "To tomorrow," he said. But there was something in his tone, something that made my stomach churn. It wasn't a toast. It was a promise. That night, I barely slept. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Sarah and Andrew. Their faces too close, their laughter too intimate. My mind raced with questions, doubts, and fears, but I told myself I was being ridiculous. Tomorrow would be perfect. Sarah and I would say our vows, and all of this uncertainty would fade away. But deep down, I knew. I didn't want to admit it, even to myself, but I knew. The cracks in the mirror were no longer invisible. They were spreading, threatening to shatter everything I thought I knew about love, trust, and family. The night before my wedding should have been a time of excitement, maybe even a few last-minute nerves. Instead, it became the moment everything I thought I knew unraveled. It was late, the kind of late where silence fills every corner of the house. I was alone, sitting at the dining table, staring at the vows I'd written for Sarah. They felt like lies now, every promise a hollow echo of something I wasn't sure existed anymore. I tried to shake off the feeling, the nagging unease that had been building for weeks. Maybe I was overthinking things, letting the stress of the wedding get to me. But as much as I wanted to dismiss it, the doubts gnawed at me, relentless and cruel. My phone buzzed. A simple notification. Sarah had left hers behind earlier in her rush to meet her bridesmaids. I don't know what made me pick it up. Maybe it was the universe nudging me, or maybe it was just that little voice inside me screaming for answers. Whatever the reason, I found myself staring at her phone, my thumb hovering over the screen. The lock screen didn't stop me. A code wasn't necessary between us, or so I thought. She trusted me with everything, or so I thought. The moment the messages opened, I realized trust had been a one-sided affair. There it was, in black and white. Messages between Sarah and Andrew. Messages that weren't just flirtatious or inappropriate. No, these were confessions of love, of passion, of betrayal so deep it felt like a knife twisting in my chest with every word I read. "Can you believe how easy it's been?" Sarah had written. "He suspects nothing. Tomorrow, it'll all fall into place." Andrew's response hit harder than I could have imagined. Of course. He's always been predictable, so desperate to be loved. "This is our moment, Sarah. After tomorrow, he's out of the picture, and it's just us." But the one that shattered me completely? I can't wait to see his face when he realizes. It'll be perfect. Perfect. The word echoed in my mind, mocking me. My wedding day, the moment I dreamed about, wasn't meant to be a celebration of love. It was a spectacle of humiliation, a stage where I was the unknowing fool. I wanted to stop reading, to throw the phone across the room and pretend I hadn't seen it. But my hand refused to let go, and my eyes refused to stop. There were more messages, ones that made it clear just how long this had been going on. Sarah and Andrew weren't a recent fling. They'd been planning this for months. Every kiss, every whispered, "I love you." Every shared moment between Sarah and me had been a lie, a distraction while she plotted her betrayal. Then I saw it. The message that left no doubt about the depth of their cruelty. Once we're married, his money will make everything easier. He's the stepping stone to the life we deserve. My money, my love, my trust, all tools in their twisted game. They'd turn my life, my future, into nothing more than a means to their selfish ends. For a moment, I couldn't breathe. The weight of their betrayal crushed me, pressing down until I thought I'd collapse under it. My mind raced with questions. How long had they been lying to me? Why would Sarah agree to marry me if she didn't love me? Was Andrew's presence in my life always a shadow, a reminder that I'd never be enough? Anger bubbled beneath the surface, hot and furious, threatening to consume me. But I couldn't let it take over, not yet. If I confronted them now, they'd find a way to twist it, to make me look like the bad guy. No, I needed to be smarter than that. I needed a plan. I set the phone down, my hands trembling, and took a deep breath. They thought they'd won, that their betrayal was a secret they'd carry to the altar and beyond. But they underestimated me. They saw me as the younger brother, the pushover, the one who always came second. They thought I'd break under the weight of their lies. But they didn't know me as well as they thought. I stayed up the rest of the night, my mind spinning with ideas. Confronting them would be too easy, too quick. They needed to feel what I felt: confusion, humiliation, and the sharp sting of betrayal. And the wedding? That would be my stage, not theirs. If they wanted a spectacle, I'd give them one. By the time the sun rose, I had a plan. It wasn't perfect, but it didn't have to be. All it needed to do was show them that they'd picked the wrong person to underestimate. I wasn't the fool they thought I was, and by the time the day was over, they'd know it. As I put on my suit, I stared at my reflection in the mirror. I didn't see the man I was yesterday, the hopeful groom excited for his future. That man was gone, replaced by someone colder, sharper, and more determined. Today wasn't just my wedding day. It was the beginning of my revenge. The morning of my wedding started like any other. The sky was clear, the sun shone brightly, and the air carried the crisp excitement of new beginnings. But for me, there was no joy. Beneath my polished suit and steady smile, a storm raged, hidden from everyone. This wasn't a wedding day. It was the battleground where I would reclaim my dignity. I arrived early at the venue, greeted by family and friends who were oblivious to the turmoil inside me. They smiled, they laughed, they congratulated me. I returned their kindness with practiced ease, nodding at their well wishes while my mind replayed the messages I had read the night before. I wondered how many of them had seen it too, how many had known about Sarah and Andrew's betrayal. The thought made my stomach churn, but I shoved it aside. Today wasn't about them. It wasn't even about Sarah or Andrew. It was about me taking control of a story they thought they could write. Sarah arrived shortly after, glowing in her wedding gown, her veil framing a face that now seemed unfamiliar. How could someone who looked so angelic carry such darkness in her heart? She smiled at me as she walked down the aisle, and I matched her expression, knowing my calmness would unsettle her more than any outburst could. She didn't know I'd seen the messages. She didn't know what I had planned, and that ignorance was my weapon. The ceremony began, the priest's voice filling the room with words that once held meaning for me but now felt like hollow echoes. I could feel Sarah's hand in mine, steady and soft, a stark contrast to the trembling anger I suppressed. Andrew sat in the front row, his smug grin barely concealed as he watched the proceedings. I could almost hear his thoughts. Just a little longer, Michael. Soon, it'll all be over. The priest turned to Sarah. Do you, Sarah, take Michael to be your lawfully wedded husband? Her hesitation was barely noticeable, but I caught it. She glanced at Andrew, and that split second was enough to confirm everything I already knew. She opened her mouth, but the words that came out weren't the ones anyone expected. I can't do this. The room froze. My heart should have shattered, but it didn't. I'd been preparing for this moment all night, and the chaos that followed was exactly what I was counting on. Whispers rippled through the crowd, guests exchanging stunned glances as Sarah stepped back, releasing my hand. I'm sorry, Michael, she said, though there wasn't a shred of remorse in her tone. Her eyes darted to Andrew, who stood from his seat like a king ascending his throne. This is Andrew's moment now. The gasps were audible, a wave of shock washing over the audience as Andrew walked toward us. His confidence was palpable, his smirk infuriating. He placed a hand on Sarah's back, pulling her close in a show of possession that made my blood boil. "Why don't you join the audience, little brother?" Andrew said, his voice dripping with mockery. "This is where you belong." Sarah nodded, her gaze meeting mine with an unsettling mix of pity and arrogance. "It's true, Michael. Andrew and I are in love. This wedding was a mistake. A mistake. That's what she called it. The vows I had written, the dreams I had shared with her, the life I had planned. It was all reduced to a mistake. But I didn't react. Not the way they expected me to. I didn't shout, didn't argue, didn't crumble under the weight of their betrayal. Instead, I smiled. "By all means," I said, stepping aside and gesturing toward the altar. "The stage is yours." The room erupted into chaos. Guests whispered furiously, some standing in disbelief, others rushing toward me with concerned murmurs. I ignored them, walking calmly to an empty seat in the front row. I could feel every eye in the room on me, waiting for me to break, to lash out, to do something, anything, that would justify the cruelty of what they had done. But I wouldn't give them the satisfaction. I sat down, my back straight, my head held high. Sarah and Andrew stood at the altar, visibly thrown off by my composure. They had expected a meltdown, a scene, maybe even a fight. Instead, they got nothing. And that nothing was everything. The priest looked unsure, glancing between me, Sarah, and Andrew. I'm not sure what to do here," he stammered, clearly unprepared for the spectacle unfolding before him. "Proceed," I said, my voice calm but firm. "Let them have their moment." Sarah and Andrew exchanged uncertain glances. For the first time, I saw cracks in their confidence. My calmness unnerved them, disrupted their plans. This wasn't the humiliation they had envisioned. This wasn't the reaction they'd banked on. As they fumbled to explain themselves to the priest, the murmurs of the crowd grew louder. I leaned back in my chair, watching the chaos unfold with a sense of detachment. They thought they had won. They thought they had broken me. But this wasn't the end. This was only the beginning. Sitting in the front row of my own wedding as my bride stood with my brother at the altar was surreal. The whispers, the stares, the chaotic disbelief. It all swirled around me, but I stayed calm. They thought I'd been defeated. They thought this was their grand finale. Little did they know, it was only the overture to their downfall. Sarah and Andrew, so confident in their treachery, had no idea what I had planned. As I sat there, the shock in the room began to morph into anger. Not mine, but from the guests. My parents, once frozen in disbelief, were now staring daggers at Andrew. Sarah's parents whispered furiously, their faces flushed with embarrassment. The tension in the room was palpable, and I let it simmer. Every second of their discomfort was a gift. Andrew, ever the showman, couldn't resist addressing the room. He stepped forward, smug and self-assured. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, spreading his arms like he was delivering a keynote speech. "I know this isn't what you expected, but love has a way of finding its path, doesn't it?" The audacity. I clenched my jaw but kept my composure. The guests were too stunned to respond, their shock rendering them silent. Sarah stood by his side, her gaze flitting nervously between him and the audience. She wasn't as sure of herself as he was. Her hand trembled slightly, the same way it had earlier. Good. Let the fear set in. I waited a moment, letting Andrew bask in his delusion before I stood. All eyes turned to me, the betrayed groom, the one they expected to lash out or crumble. Instead, I adjusted my tie, stepped forward, and spoke with a calmness that cut through the tension like a knife. "Andrew," I began, my voice steady, "you're absolutely right. Love does find its path. And today, it found yours and Sarah's. But I think our guests deserve a little context, don't you?" Andrew's smirk faltered. Sarah's eyes widened. The cracks were forming. I could feel it. "I wasn't sure whether I should say this today," I continued, turning to address the crowd. "But since the truth has already started pouring out, why not let it flow?" I pulled my phone from my pocket, tapping the screen to cue the prepared presentation. The projector at the back of the room hummed to life, casting a bright light on the wall behind the altar. The first image appeared, a screenshot of a text message exchange between Sarah and Andrew, complete with timestamps and dates. Gasps rippled through the crowd as the words came into focus. "He's clueless," Sarah had written. "Tomorrow, it's all us." Andrew's response followed, "Good. Let him play the fool. Once it's over, we're set for life." The silence was deafening. Andrew's confidence evaporated, his face paling as the magnitude of the situation began to dawn on him. Sarah took a step back, her hand flying to her mouth as though to stifle a scream. "Andrew and Sarah didn't just fall in love," I said, my voice cold and deliberate. "They plotted, they schemed, and they thought I wouldn't notice. But I did." The slides continued, each one more damning than the last. Photos of secret meetings, bank transfers that tied Andrew's financial schemes to Sarah's involvement, and, finally, the piece de resistance. Sarah's confession about using my money to fund their dream life. "This wedding wasn't about love," I said, turning to face them directly. "It was about greed, about betrayal, and about two people who thought they could manipulate me, use me, and discard me like yesterday's trash." Andrew tried to interject, raising a hand as though to stop me. "Michael, let's not do this here." "We can." "Do what, Andrew?" I snapped, my voice finally rising, sharp and cutting. "Continue the charade? Pretend you weren't standing here trying to humiliate me in front of everyone? No, today is the day you face the consequences." The guests erupted. Some were shouting, others were whispering furiously, and a few stormed out in disgust. Sarah's parents looked mortified, their faces buried in their hands. My mother, normally the quiet one, stood up and pointed a finger at Andrew. "How dare you?" she spat, her voice trembling with rage. "How dare you do this to your own brother?" Andrew looked like a deer caught in headlights, his usual bravado nowhere to be found. Sarah was crying now, her carefully applied makeup streaking down her face. I almost felt sorry for her. Almost. The final slide appeared on the screen. A photo of Andrew with another woman, his real fiancée. The room collectively gasped, and I delivered the final blow. "Let me introduce you to Catherine," I said, pointing to the photo. "The woman Andrew's been engaged to for 6 months. Funny how loyalty doesn't seem to be his strong suit." Andrew stammered, his face ghostly pale. "Michael, I can explain." "Don't bother," I interrupted. "The wedding is over. You and Sarah wanted your moment? Well, congratulations. You got it. Enjoy the fallout." I turned to the guests, many of whom were still too stunned to speak. "Thank you all for coming. I apologize for the spectacle, but I think we can all agree it's better this way." With that, I walked out, leaving the chaos behind me. As I stepped into the sunlight, I felt an odd sense of peace. They thought they'd won, but I'd turned their betrayal into their downfall. And that was just the beginning. When I walked out of that wedding, I knew I'd left behind a hurricane of chaos, but I didn't expect it to spiral as it did. The guests, stunned into silence during my presentation, finally found their voices, and they weren't kind. Sarah and Andrew, who'd thought they could turn my life into their twisted fairy tale, now stood exposed under the harsh spotlight of truth. I didn't have to witness the fallout firsthand to know what happened. I heard it all later. People couldn't stop talking about it. Apparently, the second I left the room, the guests began hurling questions, accusations, and disgusted remarks at the so-called bride and my disgrace of a brother. Sarah, dressed in what was supposed to be her moment of glory, became the subject of ridicule and scorn. "What were you thinking?" someone shouted. "How could you betray him like this?" another demanded. Sarah tried to stammer out an explanation, but the room wasn't interested in hearing excuses. Her tears, which might have softened hearts on any other day, fell unnoticed. This wasn't a room filled with sympathizers. It was a room full of people who now saw her as a manipulator, a liar, and, perhaps worst of all, a fool who thought she could have it all without consequence. Andrew didn't fare much better. His cocky grin was long gone, replaced by a pale, panicked expression as he attempted to regain control. "Let's calm down," he reportedly said, holding up his hands like a man trying to tame a wildfire. But the crowd wasn't having it. "You calm down," one of my friends yelled. "How could you do this to your own brother?" Andrew's smug facade cracked under the weight of the outrage. My parents were among the loudest voices in the room. My father, a man who had always prided himself on keeping his composure, reportedly stood up and unleashed years of pent-up frustration. "I can't believe I raised a son who would stoop this low," he said, his voice heavy with disappointment. "You've embarrassed this family, Andrew. You've embarrassed yourself." My mother, normally the peacekeeper, chimed in with tears streaming down her face. "We gave you everything, Andrew. Everything. And this is how you repay us? By betraying your own blood?" Sarah's parents weren't silent either. Her father, red-faced and fuming, turned to her with a fury I'd never imagined him capable of. "You've disgraced us, Sarah," he spat. "What kind of daughter are you? Throwing away a good man for this?" He pointed at Andrew, who flinched as if the words were physical blows. Sarah, overwhelmed by the hostility, reportedly sank to the floor, her veil crumpling around her as she sobbed. For once, she had no clever retorts, no defiance. She was a broken shell of the confident woman who had thought she could outwit me. The other guests joined in. My friends, my colleagues, even distant relatives I barely knew. All of them took turns expressing their anger and disbelief. The tide had turned so quickly that I almost felt sorry for them. Almost. I later learned that one of my uncles, a no-nonsense kind of guy, walked up to Andrew and said, "You've always been a snake, but this is a new low, even for you." Then, as if to punctuate his disgust, he grabbed his wife's hand and left, loudly declaring, "I won't waste another minute watching this circus." It wasn't just words either. People began walking out in droves, leaving Sarah and Andrew standing there, abandoned in the ruins of what was supposed to be their triumphant moment. The room, which had been full of life and celebration when I arrived, became an empty shell, echoing with the sounds of footsteps and muttered curses as guests left in disgust. By the time the chaos settled, only a handful of people remained, mostly those too curious or too stunned to leave. Sarah and Andrew, still reeling from the public flogging, reportedly sat in silence, their carefully crafted world crumbling around them. But it didn't end there. Oh no, the humiliation was only beginning. Word spread quickly. By the time I got home, I'd already received several calls and messages from friends who couldn't wait to tell me how everything had played out. Social media lit up with posts from guests who, despite their outrage, couldn't resist documenting the drama. Pictures of Sarah crying, Andrew looking panicked, and snippets of the projector presentation began circulating online. Sarah and Andrew's betrayal wasn't just a private scandal anymore. It was public. Their names were dragged through the mud, their reputations irreparably damaged. Sarah, once admired for her charm and beauty, became a cautionary tale about greed and deception. Andrew, who had always thrived on his charisma, found himself shunned by the very people who had once adored him. The fallout was swift and brutal. Sarah lost her job within days, her employer citing the public disgrace as a reason for termination. Andrew's business connections dried up overnight. No one wanted to be associated with a man so publicly branded as untrustworthy. And me? I stayed quiet. I let the world do what it would to them, knowing that their downfall was no longer in my hands. They dug their own graves. I'd simply handed them the shovels. By the time the chaos at the wedding had subsided, Sarah and Andrew were left to pick up the pieces of the disaster they had created. It wasn't just the humiliation of being exposed in front of friends and family. It was the ripple effect that followed. What they had assumed would be a moment of triumph had turned into a public unraveling of their lives. The fallout began almost immediately. Social media became a battlefield of opinions and gossip. Photos and videos from the wedding were shared widely, with captions like, "The most shocking wedding ever," and "When betrayal takes center stage." The comments were ruthless. People dissected every detail, from Sarah's tear-streaked face to Andrew's pale, stunned expression. They had become infamous overnight, their names synonymous with scandal and betrayal. Sarah's life fell apart faster than I could have imagined. Within days, Her employer contacted her to inform her that her behavior had brought negative attention to the company. She was fired without ceremony, left to deal with not only the shame but also the financial strain. Her carefully curated image of success and charm had been shattered, replaced by the perception of someone who had gambled everything and lost. Andrew, too, found himself cornered by the consequences of his actions. His business associates, many of whom had been guests at the wedding, cut ties with him immediately. They couldn't risk being associated with someone whose personal scandal had become public fodder. His investments began to crumble as word spread of his untrustworthiness. Deals fell through, clients pulled out, and creditors started calling. Andrew, who had always been the golden child, was now tarnished beyond repair. The fallout wasn't limited to their careers. Their social circles disintegrated as well. Friends who had once celebrated their charisma and charm turned their backs on them. Invitations to events stopped coming. Sarah and Andrew became pariahs, their betrayal a stain no one wanted to be associated with. Even the friends who had supported them in secret began to distance themselves, unwilling to risk being implicated in their mess. And then there were the personal consequences. Sarah and Andrew's relationship, built on lies and deceit, couldn't withstand the pressure. They started fighting almost immediately after the wedding. Blame was thrown back and forth like a game of hot potato. Sarah accused Andrew of pushing her into the plan, while Andrew claimed it had been Sarah's idea all along. Their love unraveled as quickly as their lives had. But the most crushing blow came when Catherine, Andrew's real fiancée, stepped into the picture. She wasn't just furious, she was out for blood. Catherine, a sharp and determined woman, had been blindsided by Andrew's betrayal. She wasted no time filing a lawsuit against him, seeking damages for emotional distress and financial fraud. Her testimony, coupled with the evidence I'd shared at the wedding, painted a devastating picture of Andrew's character. Sarah didn't escape Catherine's wrath, either. Catherine made it clear that she held Sarah just as responsible for the chaos, and her testimony in court was scathing. "You thought you could steal my life," she said, her voice cold and unwavering. "But now you'll have to live with the consequences." As for me, I kept my distance from the storm I had unleashed. I focused on rebuilding my life, but I couldn't help but hear about the fallout. People kept calling, eager to share the latest updates on Sarah and Andrew's downfall. It wasn't out of malice that I listened. It was closure. Every new piece of information was a reminder that I'd made the right decision to expose them. One day, Sarah showed up at my door. She looked nothing like the confident woman I had once known. Her eyes were hollow, her posture defeated. She begged for a chance to explain, to apologize, to make things right. "Michael, I made a mistake," she said, her voice trembling. "I let greed and Andrew blind me. Please, I'm sorry." I stared at her, feeling a mix of anger and pity. She had been a part of my life, someone I had loved and trusted. But her betrayal wasn't something I could forgive. Not now, maybe not ever. "Sarah," I said, my voice steady, "you didn't just betray me. You destroyed the trust we built. And for what? A fantasy that fell apart the moment it began? I can't fix what you broke, and I won't try." Andrew never came to see me. He didn't have the courage. The last I heard, he had fled the city, leaving Sarah to deal with the aftermath alone. His debts continued to pile up, and with no allies left, he was forced to sell off what little he had to avoid legal action. The man who had always lived in the spotlight was now hiding in the shadows. As time passed, the story of Sarah and Andrew became a cautionary tale. People whispered about them at parties, used their names as warnings against greed and betrayal. They had become the architects of their own misery, and their lives would never be the same. And me? I moved on, stronger and wiser than before. Their betrayal had hurt me, yes, but it had also taught me the value of resilience. I wasn't defined by what they did to me. I was defined by how I rose above it. And as I closed that chapter of my life, I knew one thing for certain. The best revenge wasn't just their downfall, it was my success. In the days and weeks that followed the wedding, I felt like I was standing on the edge of a battlefield, surveying the ruins left behind. The chaos, the betrayal, and the humiliation. They were all in the past now, but their echoes lingered. Yet, Instead of feeling defeated, I felt lighter. It was as if the weight of Sarah and Andrew's lies had been lifted from my shoulders, and for the first time in months, I could finally breathe. The road to recovery wasn't easy. At first, the anger was all-consuming. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw their faces, Sarah's look of pity and Andrew's smug grin. But as the days turned into weeks, the anger gave way to something else: clarity. I started to realize that their betrayal, as painful as it was, had been a blessing in disguise. They hadn't destroyed me, they'd freed me. I spent a lot of time reflecting on what had happened, trying to understand how I could have missed the signs. There were moments of self-doubt, times when I questioned my judgment and wondered if I'd been too trusting, too naive. But I also realized that their actions said more about them than they did about me. Sarah and Andrew had chosen deception and greed, and their choices had led them to ruin. I wasn't responsible for their downfall, they were. In the aftermath, life moved on, though not without its challenges. The public spectacle of the wedding meant that I couldn't completely escape the whispers and stares. People would approach me with awkward smiles, offering sympathy or expressing their shock at what had happened. Some even congratulated me for the way I'd handled it, calling me brave or strong. I appreciated their words, but what they didn't realize was that my strength didn't come from the exposure. It came from surviving it. Professionally, things took an unexpected turn. News of the wedding fiasco spread far beyond the guests who had witnessed it, and while I feared it would damage my reputation, the opposite happened. Clients and colleagues respected the way I had confronted the betrayal head-on. They saw me as someone who could handle adversity with grace, and in some strange twist of fate, my career thrived because of it. Meanwhile, Sarah and Andrew's lives continued to unravel. Sarah, once the picture of confidence and charm, became a shadow of her former self. She tried to apologize again, sending me letters and messages that I never responded to. Her words were filled with regret, but they couldn't undo the damage she'd caused. Andrew, on the other hand, disappeared completely. He had fled the city, his debts mounting and his reputation in shambles. The man who had once lived for the spotlight was now hiding from it. One day, as I was organizing my apartment, I came across the vows I had written for Sarah. I held the paper in my hands, reading the words that had once meant so much to me. They felt foreign now, like a relic from a different life. Without hesitation, I crumpled the paper and tossed it into the trash. It wasn't an act of bitterness, it was a symbol of letting go. The real turning point came when I decided to focus on myself. For years, I had been living in the shadows of others. Andrew's shadow, Sarah's expectations, and it was time to step into the light. I threw myself into my work, took up hobbies I'd abandoned, and reconnected with friends I hadn't seen in ages. Slowly but surely, I began to rebuild not just my life, but my sense of self-worth. Looking back, I realized that the greatest victory wasn't in exposing Sarah and Andrew, or watching their lives fall apart. It was in rediscovering my own strength. They had tried to tear me down, but all they'd done was show me what I was capable of. Their betrayal had been a fire, and I had walked through it, emerging stronger on the other side. I won't lie and say there aren't scars. Betrayal leaves its mark, and trust isn't something I give lightly anymore. But those scars are a part of me now, a reminder of what I've overcome. They don't define me, but they've shaped me, and for that, I'm grateful. In the end, the story of Sarah and Andrew became a distant memory, a tale people whispered about at parties or used as a cautionary example. But for me, it was more than that. It was the moment I stopped being a passive participant in my own life. It was the moment I took control. Now, when I look in the mirror, I don't see the man who was betrayed. I see someone who survived, who thrived, and who refused to let the actions of others define him. And as for Sarah and Andrew, they can keep their betrayal, their regrets, and their ruined lives. I've moved on, and the life I'm building now is better than anything they could have imagined. My greatest revenge isn't their downfall. It's my happiness.